Morning, everybody, and welcome to hearing 25 in relation to the rezoning proposals at Huntly. Apologies for being fractionally late this morning. One of our panelists had some internet connection issues that have taken a little while to resolve, but they now have been. I'll start off by doing a round of introductions for the panel. I think everybody has been at our hearings before, so probably knows who everybody else is, but we'll do that for the sake of completeness anyway. Then I'll run through a few of the procedural issues about how the hearing today will run. We'll then ask the individual submitters that are present or people that are observing the hearing to introduce themselves. And at the same time, if there's anything of a procedural nature or any questions about how the process will run, they can do that at that time as well. So just kicking off with some introductions. My name is Phil Mitchell. I'm chairing this hearing. I'm an Independent Hearings Commissioner from Auckland. And if the rest of the panel and then the council staff could follow suit, please.
Good morning, I'm Jan Sedgwick. I'm a Waikato District Councillor, but appointed as an Independent Hearing Commissioner.
Yes, good morning, everybody. My name's Janet Gibb. I'm a current Waikato District Councillor and appointed as an Independent Commissioner. And at this point, I'd just like to mention that I have a conflict of interest with Shand Properties, who are presenting third, I believe. So I won't be involved in that part of the hearing, nor any of the deliberations around that submitter. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Dines Fulton. I'm an Independent Commissioner, but a former Waikato District Councillor.
Morning, Nakoto Will Marg, Independent Commissioner.
Paul Cooney, Deputy Chair, Lawyer, Independent Commissioner.
Thanks. So we could just briefly have the council staff and advisor team, and then I'll just want to say a few things, and then we'll go around the room when people can introduce themselves, please.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Lily Campbell. I'm the Section 42A Reporting Officer for the Huntly Zone Extents topic.
Morning, Earl Fletcher Bell here. I'm District Plan Administrator and Hearings Coordinator for the Council. Thanks.
Morena koutou, I'm Carolyn Ratt, Assistant Counsel.
Morena everybody, Jane McCartney's from the Tuakau office, just observing, thanks.
Good morning everyone, Adam Jelly, Planner, Assistant Counsel.
Thank you all. Just by way of some introductions.
Morena Sandra Kelly for Waikato.
Oh, sorry. My apologies, Ms. Kelly. I thought my apologies. I won't make any excuses, just my apologies. Just by way of introductions to the process today, we've done a number of these Zoom hearings. In fact, we've had very few face-to-face hearings since the first lockdown in March of last year. We find these processes to be particularly efficient and allow good exchange between the people that are presenting to us and the panel. Part of the success of that is that we pre-read all the material that's provided to us. So whether it be the original submissions, the Section 42A report and its various versions, the evidence, the rebuttal evidence, the summary statements, all those sorts of things we have read. As a consequence of that, our procedure is that we're asking people to present an approximately 10 minutes highlight package of what it is they want to tell us, with a real emphasis on being what the problem is and in particular what the solution they're seeking from us to be. It's not helpful to us for people to be reading large chunks of material that we've already read. And if that is the case, we'll tend to move things along just to keep things flowing. At the end of each presentation or each presenter's information, the panel may have some questions of clarification. For those people that aren't particularly familiar with the process or don't do it very often, we're simply here to ask questions of clarification if we don't understand something, or if we want to get a bit more information on something. We're not here to interrogate anybody or to, expose them or to shoot holes in arguments, any of those sorts of things. We're simply here to understand what it is you're telling us and what you want us to do. The only time constraint that we don't apply of the sort that I've just mentioned, e.g. the 10-minute limitation, is on the Section 42A report author, and that's simply because that report has to respond to everything that we're going to hear today, and to do that in 10 minutes, really makes that rather impossible. So that's a small exemption. I do also need to note that in the same way that Ms. Gibb has a conflict of interest regarding Shand properties, I have a similar issue in respect of Genesis Energy. Mr. Matthews, who's appearing for Genesis Energy, is a business colleague of mine, and Genesis Energy is a long-standing client of our firm. So I'll take no part in the consideration of their submission evidence or any deliberations relating to it. I think that's about all I need to say by way of introduction. Is there anything from the panel that they would like to raise, or anything that they'd like to stress before we ask the submitters to introduce themselves?
No, thank you.
No, it doesn't look like it. So what we'll do now, please, then, is just go around the room, or the virtual room, and if people could just introduce themselves and explain what their role in today's hearing is, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lincoln Smith. I'm a director of Terra Firma Resources. I'll be presenting today.
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Smith.
Lucy Smith.
Richard.
Oops, sorry.
No, we'll stay with the Terra Firma case. We've seen you all before, Ms. Smith and other Mr. Smith, but I think for the record, if you could introduce yourselves, please.
Sure. Lucy Smith, planner representing Terra Firma Resources.
Thank you. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm Craig Smith, and I'm also a director of Terra Firma Resources.
Yeah, morning, Mr. Smith.
Now a button. Richard Matthews, just presenting for Genesis, as Dr. Mitchell said.
Morning all, I'm Hayden Vink from Wainui Environmental, civil engineer representing Terra Firma Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Vink.
Good morning, Commissioner, and good morning to the panel. My name is Lachlan Muldowney. I am counsel for Shand Properties. With me to my immediate left is Chris Dawson, who will be familiar to you all. We have a full room of witnesses and representatives for Shand Properties, which I won't go around and introduce right now, but can call upon at the appropriate time. And I'm in your hands, Mr. Commissioner, as to how we go about that. One question I do have is just a housekeeping matter which relates to how you intend to proceed today. Seems from the schedule that you're working with the Genesis issue first, and then the Terra Firma issue, and then moving to Shand. And if that's the case, it would be helpful if there was any indication as to when we might come on, because it may allow some of our witnesses to go and do something productive and then come back when the time is right. So it might be difficult to predict, but if there is any help that you can give us on that front, we'd be appreciative.
Oh, that is tricky, as you say. It's I imagine I think you could probably safely assume that it would be after 10 o'clock, but I'd be loath to be any more prescriptive than that. It might be later. I doubt it's earlier. I trust that's of some help.
Yes, that's very useful, sir. Thank you. So on that basis, is it appropriate for the Shand team to effectively go into mute mode and keep an eye on proceedings, but look to come back at 10 o'clock?
That's fine. I'd also note too that when people aren't, after these introductions are complete, you'll notice from your screens that a number of people who know the drill have already muted their screen, sorry, muted their audio and taken their vision off. That's what we're hoping that people will do. So you can do whatever you like in the background.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. Let's just carry on. There's a few other faces there.
Yeah. So I'm John Warrington, Principal Geotechnical Engineer with WSP, and I've been advising Waikato District Council with respect to sort of geotechnical concerns and issues.
Yes, very good. Thank you and good morning.
Morning.
Ms. Lynch, you're waving at us, but your sound's off. See your lips moving, but now that's got it.
I've got you muted me.
No, I did not. Not
Oh,
guilty.
I said host. I'll mute myself. I'm just an observer.
Okay, thank you very much. And you're for the record, an elected district councillor, as I understand it.
I am.
Thank you. All right, I think that's everybody. So I think without further ado, Ms. Campbell, we're ready to hear from you and to present your Section 42A report summary, please.
Perfect.
And I think just before you do, we can probably indicate from the panel's point of view that your reports and your summary are fulsome. We have read them. If you want to point anything out in chapters 1, 2, and 3, which are sort of background information, feel free to do so. But I think it's probably from about page 10 onwards where it gets into the meat of what today's hearing is about. So we'd ask you to focus from there onwards after whatever introductory comments you might like to make.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Mōrere koutou, ko Lili taku ingoa, no otipoti me purakau nui au, he plena taku mahi, no mai haere mai. Welcome everyone. Good morning, Chair, Commissioners and Submitters. As you know, my name is Lily Campbell and I'm the Section 42A Reporting Officer for the Huntly Zone Extents topic. As the Chair has pointed out, I will keep this brief and I will just go through the key points which I think are important. So I will begin at page 13. I do have a PowerPoint presentation which outlines the recommendations, the most up-to-date recommendations. Penna, would you see that as beneficial to show now at the beginning?
Yeah, that would be helpful. Yes, please.
I'll just bring that up onto the screen. Is that visible to everybody?
That's got it, thanks. If you wouldn't mind just getting rid of the preview, that's it.
That's it?
You read my mind. Thank you.
All right. So these are just a quick summary of the amendments to result from our recommendations as updated through the reply evidence and again through the opening statement. So we'll just start with Terra Firma Resources submission 732.2, which was in regards to the Puketereni block. As a result of the technical specialist review by John Warrington, who's here today, in regards to geotechnical matters, I've recommended that the rural zone is retained over this site. And we'll go into a bit more detail on this later. Terra Firma Resources second submission point 732.1, which was in regards to Weaver's Crossing. My recommendation remains to rezone this site from rural to village zone. In relation to the submission by Paul Anderson, in relation to the property on the Great South Road and Jackson Road, my recommendation remains to rezone from residential zone to industrial zone. Just for reference, this is in relation to the Built Smart Properties site. Next we have Shand Properties submission 778.2. This is the site in North Huntly, which is referred to as Area 1 and 1A in the submitter's evidence. My recommendation is to rezone from rural to industrial. You'll note that I recommended provisions to go with a structure plan. Those were amended in my reply evidence and A further amendment is recommended in my opening statement as a result of discussion with Chris Dawson.
Yep, that's fine and understood. Thank you.
The next is Shan Properties Submission 778.3. This is in relation to the residential area requested, known as Area 6 by the submitter. My recommendation is retained to rezone from rural zone to residential zone, in part, as you can see from the image below. And the final change is the recommendation to rezone a large portion of Huntly from residential zone to medium density residential zone. This is in relation to the submission from Kāinga Order 749.154. You'll note that there were some amendments to my recommendation in my reply evidence. And that concludes my presentation. So I'll just jump out of that. Okay, so I would like to jump forward to section 4.2 of my opening statement, which is on page 14. I've covered a little bit of this in the presentation I just showed, but section 4.2 shows some of the changes made as a result of my reply evidence. So I've taken the table from appendix 1 of my reply evidence, which is below table 2, below paragraph 25. I've just highlighted the submissions which recommendations which were made in my section 42 report as provisional, and then showed the revised recommendation, just to bring your attention back to this. I won't go into detail, I'll just leave that there. I'll then move to section 5 of my opening statement on page 15, remaining matters of contention. I'll just highlight, start first with Shan Properties at section 5.1. The two issues of contention raised were the duplication of the stormwater breach assessment on the industrial zoned land, which was requested by Shan Properties. The second issue of contention was the exclusion of low-lying areas from the rezoning of Area 6, which was to be residential, requested by Shan Properties. Would the panel like me to expand on these issues, or?
I think it would be, but I don't think you need to address issue 1 in relation to Shan Properties, because you explained what the issue was, and I think you essentially agree with Mr. Dawson and have reached common ground on that. So it's simply a wording matter. So I think we can take that as read, but I think it would be helpful if you take us through from 5.1.2 onwards, please.
Yes, perfect. So issue in contention 2, yes. Chris Dawson in his evidence noted that he does generally concur with the recommendation to rezone residential, but disagrees with the recommendation to only rezone those parts which are above the defended area. So there disagrees with the exclusion of the area which is defended. This was considered poor planning practice to create a split zone, which would mean that the residential aspect of the land is on the residential zone, whereas the infrastructure associated with that residential development would be within the rural zone. Initially, I was concerned about flood risk. Chris Dawson pointed out that the subdivision of land within the defended area would require a detailed assessment of a number of factors, including flood risk. I agree with Chris Dawson. I am satisfied that the restricted discretionary activity status for subdivision under the residential zone and the natural hazard chapters of the plan will adequately manage flood risk and residual risk. Despite this, I do have residual concerns in relation to the wetland feature that was identified by Andrew Blanley in his evidence, which was evidence for Shan Properties. So I'll draw your attention to figure 7, which shows the wetland feature in the context of my recommended zoning. That's on page 18 of my evidence. So in paragraphs 45 to 50, I do go into the rationale for retaining the rural zone over the lower portion of the site. To summarise, I consider that rule 16.4.1 does not provide sufficient scope to address the potential effects of the wetland. I consider that retention of the rural zone will provide better outcomes for the wetland, as the rural zone provides a non-complying activity status, which allows a broader scope of assessment for council officers and those effects on those wetland qualities can be assessed. At paragraph 49, I did suggest a potential matter of discretion, but I noted that this would be a scope issue. Therefore, in the absence of such a consideration, I've said that I would like to maintain my recommendation in relation to this rezoning. So that's that issue briefly summarised. I'll then move on to section 5.2, which covers matters of contention that are remaining in regards to terra firma resources. Just drawing your attention to the technical specialist review that was taken by John Warrington in relation to the Puketewini block. So I revised my recommendation in my reply evidence, as you would have seen, to reject the submission by terra firma resources to rezone the land from rural to residential. Lincoln Smith addressed the technical specialist report in his expert evidence, and he outlined points of agreement and disagreement. I won't go into those now, as you've all read those. After the receipt of this rebuttal evidence by terra firma resources, a pre-hearing meeting was held on Tuesday, 22nd of June to discuss these matters of contention, these geotechnical matters. John Warrington has since reviewed the rebuttal evidence of Lincoln Smith, and he's provided a response in writing that is attached to this opening statement. A secondary discussion was held on Wednesday, the 30th of June. The key outcome of this pre-hearing discussion was acknowledgement by parties that further investigations are required as a prerequisite for rezoning of the site. And that's the reason I have maintained my recommendation to reject the submission by terra firma resources. That would be all in relation to that issue. 5.3 of this opening statement addresses the further submission by Genesis Energy. Apologies, this was omitted from my section 42A report, and I omitted to make a recommendation on this further submission. I note that Richard Matthews stated that he considers residential intensification could result in potential increased reverse sensitivity effects on the Huntly Power Station, and he requested a number of amendments. In paragraph 66 of my opening statement, I've noted that I've reflected on this evidence, but I consider it doesn't provide enough detail for me to make a recommendation on the proposed provisions of Chapter 16. I consider that these amendments proposed by Genesis Energy do have the potential to impose additional restrictions on development in the medium density residential zone, and this could impede the purpose of the zone. I also note a potential issue relating to scope, because these changes requested by Genesis were made in a further submission rather than an original submission. I note that a further submission can only support or oppose an original submission, but cannot increase scope. In the event that further evidence on these potential reverse sensitive effects is provided and the scope issue is revised, I would be happy to reconsider my recommendation in relation to this further submission by Genesis Energy. And that concludes my opening statement for the Huntly rezoning extents. I look forward to hearing any evidence presented by submitters and welcome any questions that the panel might have.
Thank you, Ms. Campbell. That's a very helpful summary. Thank you. It's hit the nail on the head in terms of what we need to consider. So thank you for that. I'll see if there's any questions from the panel. Can I start with you, please, Ms. Gibb?
Yes, no questions at the moment. Thank you. I'll listen to submitters.
Thank you. Ms. Sedgwick?
Thank you. I have no questions. The report was very clear and well put together. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mark?
No, nothing from me, Ms. Campbell. Thank you very much.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions, but thanks for your very precise summary.
Mr. Cooney?
Yes, firstly, thanks, Ms. Campbell, for your report. A lot of work goes into that, and I can see that you've done a lot of work on it. So, so thanks for that. Just on the Shan property seeking residential and the issue over the wetland, that issue's got wider implications than just the Shan property, hasn't it, with the NPS freshwater coming in. it's a consideration that needs to be given in the subdivision rules 16.4.1. Are you saying there that we've got no jurisdiction to impose a discretionary consideration on that issue? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it was my interpretation that there was no scope to amend the rule to include an additional matter of discretion. But if there were thoughts otherwise, as you can see at paragraph 49, I've suggested a matter of discretion, which I think could fill this gap. Yes, so definitely if that scope issue was resolved, I think that would be a good way to address those effects.
So we should be looking, we should be looking wider and see if there's any submissions that we've received to see if there is scope. And if there is scope, you would agree with that you wouldn't be splitting the zone, in other words.
Yes, exactly. If that matter of discretion was something council could consider, I'd think those effects were addressed. And yes, I did point out as well, I think that the inclusion of a matter of discretion like this would assist the council in giving effect to the NPS-FM, which at this point it could be seen as not doing that. But yeah, that's a matter for discussion.
All right. Okay. Those conditions that you suggested, I think the ones that allow permitted activity in the industrial zone, you've got, I think, got three standards almost there. Is that? Can you just are you able to put those up?
Yes.
I think they're in your summary statement.
I'll share my screen with you.
Yeah, sure.
Can everyone see that now?
Yep.
Yes, thanks.
Yep.
Would you like
those
to read
ones?
the drafting, or?
Yeah, those ones there. Are they really a permitted activity standard? Have you checked to see that they provide some sort of certainty that anyone reading the plan knows that, well, I don't need to get a consent because I meet these standards? Have you? Because it's one of the interpretation provisions for a permitted activity is to ensure certainty. Have you looked at that issue at all?
Not that particular issue, no. I've tested it with colleagues and usability, but no, that could be something to look into.
Yeah, or maybe the planner for Mr. Shan can comment on that. I'm completely open-minded on it, but I just want to know, I just have some reservations whether they are certain enough, that's all, but let's explore that later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Campbell. Just two questions from me. The first one's just following on to the defended area issue, or sorry, not the defended issue area, so the wetland issue per se. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that all things being equal, the wetland area or a single zoning should apply to a particular area, and it's really only the issue of scope that's potentially causing you to depart from that. Have I understood that part correctly?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I just wonder though, when we go back to rule 16.4.1, the subdivision rule in the rural zone, one of the matters of discretion there is the likely location of future buildings and their potential effects on the environment. When a council planner was looking at that matter of discretion, knowing that the NPS-FM is sitting there as well, wouldn't that potentially be a clearly a matter that any subdivision plan would need to consider, bearing in mind that any works within a wetland would require resource consent if it wasn't prohibited? I just wonder if it is already there, that it's just that it's not sticking up in lights.
Yes.
Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, I did consider that, and thought long and hard about how that could be interpreted. And where I got to was that the likely location of future buildings didn't quite provide enough scope. It wasn't explicit enough. That was essentially where I got to, that the likely location of future buildings does not refer to the entire development. There's a range of effects which are not just related to the buildings. So that was where I got to on that issue.
Okay, thank you. Second question relates to Puketerini. And as I read the various pieces of evidence and so forth, there doesn't appear to be a lot of disagreement on technical grounds, that geotechnical, and that is that geotechnical matters will need careful attention before any buildings are actually constructed. And I suppose the question I've got is, you're saying, well, you can't do the zoning until you've addressed that issue. Whereas the terra firma people are saying, well, that clearly can be a matter that's able to be addressed at subdivision stage quite explicitly. What's your specific response to the terra firma position? Because you can draw a line at different points in the process. And I'm wondering, Mr. Craig Smith has said that doing that work in advance of rezoning is prohibitively expensive. I think they're the words that he used. And as long as the plan clearly articulated that there was a question mark and that subdivision consent, wouldn't automatically be granted, and it would be, I think, restricted discretionary anyway, so it could be declined. What would be wrong with doing the rezoning, making very clear that those issues were live?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I think it's very much to do with the level of certainty. And I've taken advice from John Warrington, whose opinion is that there is not enough certainty from the testing that's been taken so far. And certainty, I guess, for a planner then is a direct result of that is risk. And essentially, I take that advice from John that there's not enough certainty to know that there could not be quite severe risks. It's essentially just the unknown. And I completely understand the costs of that testing are prohibitive, but happy to discuss if this.
Maybe could ask Mr. Warrington as well, but I suppose the point is that it's a question of when those risks would be assessed. And as long as those risks were assessed before anyone started building on the land, does it really matter when in the lead up to that it happens? I mean, the absolutely unacceptable scenario would be to say, don't worry about it, and we'll do the testing after all the roads have gone in and after the houses have been built, and then they all start moving down the hill. But if it's done at the subdivision stage and the risk was seen to be unacceptable, and that was a matter that was clearly framed as being relevant at the time of the subdivision consent application, what would be wrong with that? Where does the risk arise in relation to that process?
Potentially, may I pass this question on to John Warrington?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So.
Thanks, Mr. Warrington.
Yep,
I don't need to start again, do I?
Yeah. No, I fully understand. Yep. Yep. It's probably best as well if I share my screen at this point.
Sure. Okay? Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So. Yeah. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see it, but we can't read it.
No, it's okay. I will blow it. I've got a few windows open on it because there's a few here that I want to refer to
very good.
at the same time. Yep. Yep. Okay. Yeah, so I think in terms of the evidence that I've seen with respect to the development of the site, there has been a ground investigation that's been undertaken over the site, but that extends to a relatively shallow depth. I mean, we're looking at it's basically just looked at and assessed the top 3 meters of ground across the site area. Now, in terms of the work that's been done there, that highlights that there is variability in terms of the ground conditions across the site. There are sections where it's poor, sections where it's good enough for housing and road construction, areas where there may be specific engineering design that's required. Yeah, but there's nothing in there in terms of that ground investigation that's been undertaken to date that has been provided in support of the application that indicates that it would preclude development across that area. But the key risk is really relating to the quarrying activities that were undertaken historically. Now, so can we see this?
We can barely. If you could.
Yeah, I will blow it up a bit more.
Needs to be about twice the size that you'd see it on your screen before we can. That's right. Good.
Thank you. Is that okay?
That's perfect.
All right. Yeah. So this is the Puketerini block here, and this is the area in particular that they're looking to. They are looking to rezone the whole area from rural to residential, commercial. Historically, this area though here represents the old mine working. You can see the road down here and going around the periphery here. That is the extent of the workings that were undertaken. I'll come on to I've got another one open somewhere.
So I think in short, Puketerini is the old open cast pit, and the area, the Puketerini block is where the overburden was
that's
laid down.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So what happened during the rehabilitation work? So the original mine workings were undertaken in this area, and the various basically arisings from the excavation were sort of deposited around the area. And then as the mine workings extended north, then this area here, they were looking to rehabilitate the area. So in order to basically undertake that, there was a bund that was constructed across the area of the mine here, behind which filling took place. So the arisings from the excavation works and those heaps that lay around the area were basically used to construct the bund, and then the excavation, the excavated materials were placed behind the bund as basically work progressed.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see on this section here the progress of those works. So this is the area to the north that you saw on the previous plan, and this is the bund that was constructed, the bund number 8, and the rehabilitation works were undertaken over a period of about 5 years, and you can see here the dates of the various works that were undertaken. So
the bund was built sequentially.
Yeah.
Filled behind it, and then the bund was raised, more filling, unraised, more filling.
That's right. So the bund was built here. The bund was built essentially of, you can see here, what's fire clay. I don't know if you can see there. I'll just blow it up a bit bigger. So fire clay material. So that's basically clay material that underlies coal seams. So it's a relatively impermeable material. Yeah. So the initial bund was built here in 85, 86, and then excavated materials were placed behind it. And at the same time, the bund was extended to a higher level, and then it proceeded in stages. So the bund was raised, and then the material was backfilled behind it, up until 1990, when the final section of bund was put in place, and the final layer of material was placed behind that, and landscaping works undertaken to complete the work. Following this, groundwater levels were allowed to rise over a period of time to the current level, lake level here, which is some, as you can see here, some 43 meters or so above the level of the original base of the quarry. I understand actually that I think that the quarry further north extends to a deeper depth. It's used as a dive training facility, isn't it? Correct me if I'm wrong. So I think the quarry bed, the base of the quarry itself dips down, and the base of the quarry here was at a higher level historically. So if we just go back to this this drawing here, this basically shows the construction of the bund. So the
Could you blow that up just a little bit, please, Mr. Warren?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
That's better. Thank you.
That's better. Okay.
Yep,
yeah,
that's got it.
So the uphill slope with the bund was excavated a slope of 1.5 to 1, and the
So this is turned around the other way from the other.
Yeah, it is.
Drawing,
yeah,
isn't it?
right.
Looking the other direction.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And those were constructed at a slope of 2 to 1, and
Yep.
then the lake levels extended up to this level here. A chimney drain, a sand chimney drain, was constructed in that. That was essentially constructed to manage groundwater levels as the filling works took place, so that groundwater sort of that built up behind this area here would be basically managed by the sand chimney and drained out through into the lake level lower down through here we go through lateral drains. Yep. And that was basically just to control the groundwater levels within this area and prevent issues with stability, slippage. Subsequently, as the lake level has risen, that has become redundant because levels will have stabilised. Groundwater will be at some position up here, extending down to the lake level here. So effectively, that sand chimney has become redundant. The main concern I have is with respect to the overall stability of this. The proposed development is going to extend over a significant area to the south side. The engineering properties of the risings that were placed here are unknown in terms of the quality of the compaction that was undertaken. Whether the material was selected and placed in layers and compacted in an appropriate manner according to the nature of the material, whether it was a clay or a cohesive or cohesionless material, would require different compaction. So you understand what I mean by that in terms of the way it's actually compressed in order to improve its placed strength, if you like, in the long term. There's no information with respect to what the engineering properties are of that material and how those might have changed over the time since the material was placed. There is a concern with respect to the overall stability of this slope, therefore, of the bund and the slope behind, from both a static perspective under a seismic event and also under what's called an ultimate limit state stability event, which is a 1 in 500 year earthquake, effectively. And there's been no assessment undertaken of the overall stability of this earth bund, basically the structure, in order to retain the material on which the development is proposed to be constructed. So the concern I have is essentially with respect to the overall stability of this and the impact it might have on the development to the south side. Now, there are also guidelines in terms of what is required with respect to rezoning of areas. This is issued by the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment. I'll blow this up again because you're not going to be able to see this, sorry. So can we see this? Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's guidance in terms of the minimum number of and the important thing here is deep intrusive geotechnical site investigation that's required for planning purposes. And this is from the Earthquake Geotechnical Engineering Practice guidance, which has been compiled by the Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment and the New Zealand Geotechnical Society. A lot of this was done post Christchurch. There's been a lot of work undertaken for obvious reasons with respect to developments in terms of rezoning and also in terms of subdivision development post rezoning. And you can see here in terms of plan change, the recommendation is that the minimum number of deep intrusive geotechnical investigation locations should equate to 0.2, that's 0.2 holes, if you like, boreholes or cone penetrometers. That's a probe that's extended down through into the ground at depth of 0.2 per hectare. Now, the area of the site is 27 hectares, which if you were to multiply that by 0.2, it basically equates to this sort of 5.4. So rounding it up, that would indicate there would be a minimum required number of 6 deep intrusive geotechnical investigations, locations, deep boreholes or cone penetrometers required over that area in order to inform issues that might be associated with the rezoning of that area, which would apply for this particular site. As I say, given also the implications that we have with respect to the overall stability here, that the bund number 8 is in this location here, and then the ground rises up behind here. If you were to consider a 1 in 500 year earthquake event, and the steepness of the slope running into the lake and the fact that this bund has been submerged, I do have a concern with respect to what the stability of the slope would be under that ULS 1 in 500 year earthquake event. And so that deep intrusive ground investigation advice that was provided in conjunction with an assessment, a stability assessment of this structure would help me to inform a decision with respect to the stability of that, that would therefore give confidence that if that's proved to be satisfactory, that the development could proceed, could be rezoned and could proceed in accordance with the application. Whether 6 deep intrusive exploratory holes is enough considering the area, there may need to be more undertaken in order to provide sufficient information to support a stability assessment, but that would need to be ascertained at the time that work is undertaken. So that, in essence, in summary, is my take on things.
That's a very helpful summary of both of your rebuttal evidence and the situation generally.
Yeah.
And I think I know the answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. Roughly speaking, what's the cost of one of those geotechnical holes that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, you can see that given the height that we've got of the structure, essentially we're looking at a structure that's of the order of 45 meters in height. Yeah, and it would take probably a week if we were going to sink a borehole. We would have to do boreholes in order to be able to recover samples for laboratory testing, in order to assess the strength of the soils that are present, materials that are present within that column of soil materials. So you'd be looking at a week per borehole, and typically you'd be looking at of the order of something like sort of $4,000 per day. So you'd be looking at something of the order of $24,000 per hole in terms of time required. So if we were going to undertake, say 4 boreholes, and then say some cone penetrometer tests is basically a machine that it pushes a probe down, and those can be done fairly quickly. You could probably do sufficient within a couple of days, which would be of the order of $6,000 to $7,000 for that work. But it's the boreholes that would take the time. And as I say, you'd be looking at somewhere in the order of $20,000 per hole. So if we were going to do 4 holes on the site, you'd be looking at anything from something like probably 80,000. Possibly
presumably plus the geotechnical tests, plus
yeah, that's right, plus laboratory testing, plus.
So you've said, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you've said 6 holes as per this guideline document.
That's the minimum required by the
150,000 for time.
Yeah,
might be in the order of a couple of 100,000.
You'd be looking probably
time you've done the assessments and so forth.
Yeah, that will probably be. Yeah, probably tops. Yeah. So you probably more.
Okay. No, I just wanted to get an understanding.
It is not an insubstantial amount of money, and I can
understand. Thank you.
It's a timing issue essentially. Yeah.
Can I just ask you too about this Geotechnical Society and IMBY document? It's been around now for nearly 5 years.
Yeah.
What is it? What's its? I mean, you've said what it is. It's a document produced by these 2 organisations approximately 5 years ago, but it hasn't been incorporated into anything like a New Zealand standard or any of those sorts of things, presumably, or has it?
Well, it's in terms of sort of geotechnical assessment, and it's there in terms of planning as well. It's common practice amongst the geotechnical discipline to follow the guidance that's provided within that document. And as I say, it's been produced post the Christchurch earthquake event, and is used by the geotechnical discipline in general.
When does it apply though? I mean, it says 0.2 holes per hectare, as you pointed out, but does that apply to any subdivision on any sort of land, or are there some thresholds that need to be breached before you get into this?
Well, it would apply if you're going to rezone. Yeah, there are. If I just go back to that table, it depends on the area basically. So you're looking at if it was a small area, 2,500 square meters, that's 1/4 of a hectare. You'd be looking at a minimum of 2. Anything less than 1 hectare would be a minimum of 3, and then greater than 1 is this minimum of 5. Obviously, I mean, that's why I say in respect of this particular site, because you've got 27 hectares, a minimum of 5 would appear to be probably insufficient in terms of assessing, given the overall area of the site, to actually determine what is happening in the ground over that area. It's not an insignificant area, and you could get quite a significant variation in terms of ground conditions across that area. And so that's why there's this minimum number required with respect to that particular activity in terms of plan change. You can see actually in terms of subdivision consent, the density of investigation that's required is significantly greater. And I suppose it's how do you define what is a deep intrusive geotechnical insight investigation? How deep does it go, basically? Now, with respect to this particular site, because you've got a very large earth structure, it's almost like a tailings dam in essence in terms of the way it works. And that you've got a bund that's built up in series with material that's built up behind it. And it's over the order of sort of 40, 45 meters deep. So it's quite a significant structure. So in order to be able to assess the stability of that, the ground investigation is going to have to go down to a not inconsiderable depth. If it was a flat area of land, without any kind of issues like that, any kind of structure like that involved, you might go down sort of, it depends on the ground conditions that you're having to deal with, of course, and then this would come from a geotechnical investigation, assessment of the site, a desk study initially, that would help to inform what would be required with respect to the site works, the geotechnical investigatory site works that would be needed. But on a normal sort of site, then you might expect maybe boreholes to go down sort of 15, 20 meters, CPT is the same. So it would be significantly, in terms of scope, a significantly lesser scope of work for that type of site than this particular one. So you've got to take each site on its own merits, effectively.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, I understand that. I suppose we've seen a number of plan change or rezoning proposals through this process, and certainly accept the fact that none of them have been placed on old overburden disposal areas behind a fund. But to the best of my knowledge, none of these other sites have done this sort of investigation. And does that mean that they should have, or does that mean that there are some thresholds where these provisions start to kick in?
I would suggest these, I mean, this was introduced in 2016.
16,
yeah. And has obviously been in development and has gone through sort of various revisions over that period. Yeah. So it is a recent introduction. Yeah, and as I say, it's consequential to Christchurch. There are a number of other documents like this relating to things like liquefaction and how you would approach that in terms of detailed design for buildings.
No, that's fine. Look, I don't think I can take it into that. So I think we're starting to go over old ground, but that's fine. Can I just ask you one more question? And you may or may not know the answer to this. Do you know what sort of planning advice the geotechnical engineers sought in coming up with the distinction between plan changes and subdivision? Just an unusual document for engineers to be making judgments.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, yeah. I see where you're coming from with it. This is the plan change is basically if you like, an initial investigation to determine what the overall suitability would be, and if there are any big issues with respect to development. Then when you go down to the subdivision consent, then you're looking at things in more detail with respect to specific structures that might be going on there.
Okay, but would you agree with me that irrespective of the first column in that graph or that table, whether it's a plan change or a subdivision, the key issue is that before any building is undertaken, then work of this sort be undertaken? Is that the most important factor from your point of view?
Yeah, that's right. It would be in terms of, again, if you ignored this, so prior to this, if you like.
If you just put your hand over the plan change bit. And said, you need to, before you build anything, build anything on here, you need to do a thorough, deep,
you would do
intrusive geotechnical site investigation.
Yeah, again, given you'd do a desk study, you'd look at it, you'd look at the issues that pertain to that particular site. And as I say, given that there are some pretty unique issues with respect to this particular site, it has to be said, that would be identified at that desk study stage, and then you would scope an investigation, a geotechnical study based on those findings. So without this, prior to this, that's the way it would have worked. I would certainly have recommended that a thorough ground investigation, well, I say thorough ground, a preliminary ground investigation be undertaken in order to explore that particular issue. As I say, in this case, it would be a stability assessment for that, particularly the seismic event. And then once you've established that it is actually safe to go forward and basically, in this case, rezone the site, then that would be the recommendation for the report, or otherwise, if we found anything was untoward.
All right, that's really helpful. Thank you, Mr. Warrington.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask, I think if there's any questions from the panel, let's start that process again. Mr. Marg, let's start with you.
Yes, Mr. Warrington, the bund has been in place for near on 30 plus years now. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be about right. Yeah, is that
And
right,
then-
Lincoln? I don't know if Lincoln's on. Lincoln's.
I think your drawing said 1990 to 1991. was the
It's
top
the
level.
order of. It's the order of. Yeah, 30 years. Or so.
Are you aware in that time, has there been any breaches of the bund?
Not within that time, no. But as I said before, I mean, can you say, has there been any seismic event that might have caused instability, basically, over that? That is the key issue here, really, is that in order to be able to
manage a perceived risk.
Yeah, that's right, manage the risk associated with the site. That's what you would need to consider. So you can't take things on just face value. You would need to do a detailed assessment, basically, putting those kind of criteria in there to make a judgment call on it, an appropriate judgment call on it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Marg. Mr. Fulton?
No, I don't have any questions. Thank you very much.
Ms. Sedgwick?
I have two questions. Thank you. Very interesting, actually, I find this. Can you tell me, as a complete layperson on the topic of bunds, what holds a bund in place, and would it mean an underlying bund built, say, at 85, 86 could collapse and take the rest with it, or how? And the other corollary to that is how strong are sand chimneys? Are they likely to get waterlogged, and what happens?
Yeah. I mean, if you think of it, it's almost like a dam, basically, except this is retaining earth as opposed to water. Yep. Now, like a dam is constructed, it has to be. You have to be satisfied and have to effectively have evidence that and be confident that the dam has been constructed to an appropriate standard, minimum standard, and that you've actually got that evidence available to confirm that it's been constructed in accordance with the design. And in this particular instance, that design would be, it would need to be able to withstand this 1 in 500 year earthquake event. So what you will have done an analysis and assessment that would have been based on a minimum strength requirement for the dam, the earth that's gone into the dam structure itself, but also in terms of it's important to remember that the backfill that's behind there you would also need to take into consideration what the strength of that is like when it's placed. So if you imagine that the dam was built, the bund was built, and it was built from a softer material, or it hadn't been compacted properly, and then the quarry risings, the minor risings have been placed behind it, and they've been placed loosely, then you would say that would be effectively quite a loose, could potentially be an unstable structure, as opposed to a structure that where you're confident that the bund has been placed to a minimum standard. So you've got, if you like, testing specification, if you like, that the materials that have gone into constructing that have been placed in accordance with that design requirement, and the same with the material that's gone in behind it. Yeah.
So this was a state-owned energy. So do we have all that evidence, or have you viewed all that evidence that shows the build?
No, there's been no testing. There's been no evidence provided in terms of any design that's been undertaken for the bund. Design calculations and basically parameters for that design in terms of the soil materials for the design. Nor has there been any evidence provided in terms of the strength of those materials as they've been placed, other than reports from I don't know if it was a consultant, but there have been reports provided that have stated that the material has been placed in an appropriate manner, basically. But there's been no physical evidence provided, if you like, of what the actual strength of those materials is. So if I, from a professional perspective, if I was going to be satisfied that this, the structure of this earth the construction of this earth structure is satisfactory. I couldn't say that without doing further testing and stability assessment.
And I was interested to read that the method of testing. I just wondered, given the size of the land and what you referred to earlier about the non-engineered fill, what degree of certainty, and to the questions that the chair raised, what degree of certainty would you get from a hole? And how far could you extrapolate that certainty, given that you can't be confident of what was in it?
This is always the problem with geotechnical engineering, I'm afraid, is that, nothing is ever 100% certain, but you have to you can't rely on no evidence. You have to obtain some information, basically. So, I mean, this is why this table is provided, if you like, in order to provide some guidance in terms of what the minimum requirement would be. Now, this would be a minimum requirement for probably a flat site. Yeah, this is different in terms of we've got this earth structure here, so we'd be needing to do something probably.
So that guidance, would that be on? So you say a flat site, or would it be on evidential-based engineered fill?
No, this would be for any site, ignoring what the material might be underlying the site. This would be just based on an area for rezoning. Yeah, this would be a minimum recommended number.
Right.
As I say, it could be all in situ natural material. Yeah, that you're looking to rezone, and this is a minimum recommendation with respect to that, effectively. Now, as I say, given what we understand about this particular site and its history, there are obviously issues in respect of concerns with respect to the geotechnically, with respect to the construction methodology and the strength of materials, the type of materials that have been used in the construction, which, as I say, from a geotechnical perspective, would mean that we would need to undertake probably a greater number than that minimum indicated there.
Thank you, Mr. Warrington. That's really, really helpful. I appreciate that.
Yep.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb.
Yes, I'm following on from Ms. Sedgwick, actually, and really much as a layperson. There was mention when we looked at the diagrams from State Coal of the bund construction, and there was I think there was that clay was put in there. What other types of material do you know would be put in there? Like, is there sand? Is there other, I don't know, clean fill?
So this is right. So yeah. So we're looking at this is what you're referring to.
Yes, I think they said there was some word in there that said, "Oh, that's fire clay."
Fire clay. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
In the bund, would that have been also put in the backfill?
It could have been. We don't know.
So we don't know what was put in to backfill that at all.
No, it could be. We do know that it would have been the overburden from the quarry area, the mine area. I say quarry, it's a mine. Yeah. And we do have information with respect to what that comprises. It's called Hinawera deposit. So it's relatively recent deposits geologically, and comprises a mix of sands, gravel, silts, some clays, some organic materials. So we're looking at possibly some peaty type materials in there. So you've got all that material that has been removed from the mine, that then goes down into that rock layer where the coal seams are. So you've then got that coal, that rock that's been removed above the coal seams, yeah, in order to get at it, basically. I think there were 2 coal seams that were extracted that were mined. So you've then got that. It'll be probably broken rock that's been extracted from the mine workings that will also have gone into the backfill material. So you've got quite a mix of material. So they explicitly say here within this drawing that they used fire clay for the construction of the bund, and the reason for that, as I said before, would be because during the during its construction, there would have been activities going on to the north side, and as the filling would have been taking place, groundwater levels would have been rising on the south side. Yeah. So they would want to manage that, and whilst maintaining the stability of the overall structure, which was the reason for putting in this this sand drain here, basically, in order to manage that. So you can imagine groundwater would be rising here within this fill material here. And what they wouldn't do would be, they wouldn't want would be this groundwater here moving across into this area, which could potentially cause instability within the slope. So the sand chimney was put in there in order to trap that water and then lead it away into the lower areas. And so basically you're managing the groundwater table in here that would help improve the stability of this area.
Mr. Warrington, so how do we know that there wasn't other foreign items used to backfill? So you're talking about that it was backfilled from the mining side, and like I'm not speaking in technical terms, obviously. Foreign objects, etc. Like I'm thinking back to a previous hearing where I did ask a question about emissions from dump sites, for example. And I was told that an open, like this is to do with underground mine as well, emissions that come from sites or other, so with this is an open cast mine. So I was told there wouldn't be emissions, but if you have organic material, surely that settles and that gives off emissions.
Oh yeah, I mean we're talking about there wouldn't be. I mean, the way that these materials were deposited, there would have been periods. I mean, basically, all this was basically like a floodplain, over a series of years, millennia, well, thousands of years, if you like, And so there would have been periods when there would have been basically sort of rivers flowing through this, which is where you get the sands deposited. Then there would have been periods when it would have been a bit like you see within the Huntley area now, either side of the river, where you've got swampy areas, and therefore you get organic materials like peats and those kind of materials being deposited. And this all comes in layers, basically. But from the evidence that we've got, for the knowledge that we have with respect to the stratigraphy within the area, there wouldn't be I would have anticipated a significant volume of organic material that would have been in there. And probably the likelihood is probably that at the time that the mine was being worked, that this material would have been separated and deposited elsewhere, given in recognition of the fact that it had greater potential to decompose and cause problems in the longer run. So I wouldn't have thought that, given that this was, you have to recognise that this was properly engineered at the time, during its rehabilitation, that the materials will have been placed in an appropriate manner. I think we can have confidence in that. But what we don't have, I think, as I said before, is the fact we don't have any information in terms of the engineering parameters of that. We don't know. We haven't had any information in terms of the design calculations that were probably undertaken at the time in order to be able to provide this drawings, these details, which is why we need to undertake that investigation now in order to have confidence about the stability of this overall.
And that's the bores. So I know that times have moved on, and there are things like X-rays that can be taken to see what's under the ground. Is that an alternative to know what's there?
No, not in this circumstance. No, you would have to. It's because we would need to recover samples and test them.
Yes.
See what's there.
Yes.
In terms of the strength of that material. But if it's
All right. No, I appreciate
the density of it. Yeah, basically, it's whether it's a cohesive clay or a sound cohesionless, we would need to understand what the ground conditions are like in order to complete that stability assessment.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Warrington. No more questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Cooney, anything from you?
Just briefly, I've listened carefully to everything you've said, Mr. Warrington, but why? And you've said, well, there's big warning lights here, and I can understand that given the history of the site. But as the chair mentioned, and I don't think you've directly answered it, is why can't this risk assessment be transferred to the time of any subdivision of the land?
Well, I think it has to do really with the planning side of this. I think it may be that the planners may be better able to answer this particular question. But in terms of informing that decision, it's quite a significant change, isn't it, to rezone an area from what is essentially rural, where if you were to get a failure, the circumstances of that failure would be significantly different than it would be if it was to be rezoned as residential, where the consequences would be, certainly significantly changed. So, it's really in order
just on that point.
Yeah.
Nothing gets built until you're satisfied that the land is suitable for development. At that point, nothing gets built.
That's
I know
right. Yeah.
it's probably not satisfactory to have a residential zoning, but from a pragmatic point of view, you can have your belts and braces at the time of subdivision, couldn't you?
Well, I would disagree with that. As I say, from a professional perspective, if you're rezoning it, then for housing, for residential, I should say, then you that would be, yes, you would undertake specific and probably a denser basically concentration of boreholes over that particular area from a design perspective. Yeah, but from as I say, from a professional perspective, recognizing that there's the potential here for housing development to take place and the consequence of that, I would be concerned about the risk to that particular development going forward without some confidence that this what is basically a significant structure that would impact on that area should it fail, but not be investigated further.
But that's the debate I'm having with you, and what the chair was having with you is that nothing gets built until it's been proved that the land will be suitable for residential development through the subdivision requirements, and they can be crafted in such a way as to require an in-depth investigation into the site.
It boils down to basically it's an assessment of risk. I've showed you the guidance, the MBA guidance here in terms of what is required with respect to plan change. Yeah, and it's due to that. Essentially, it's down to that assessment of risk.
Mr. Warrington, where does the risk arise in zoning a piece of land and changing the colour on a map if you can't build anything on it either way until you've done a subdivision consent? There's no risk at all. The risk is to the person that owns the land that when they do this work, they don't get the cost of the holes back because the work says it's unsafe. If it's zoned residential and it can only be developed as residential once the subdivision consent is granted, and that subdivision consent requires these geotechnical risks to be addressed to the satisfaction of the council, otherwise consent won't be granted. How does that pose any risk to anything? There is no risk.
Well, I think I would actually beg to differ, because without an assessment, you wouldn't know how far back, say, this potential risk would extend. Yeah. And it could be.
You've got to do that work. We accept that.
Yeah.
But why does it have to be done now? There's no risk. The risk only arises if you start building on the land.
Well, okay. So if you don't do it, if you were not to make an assessment of the risk now and then go down, you grant that subdivision, the rezoning can take place to residential. Yeah. You then do the investigation, and you find that you get the same answer. That
Exactly.
could happen. That could happen. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but then the issue would be, why was it rezoned? You've also got.
Well, that's a planning question. That's not something that you need to worry about.
It is. It is a planning question, essentially. Yeah, it is a planning question.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. But what would the situation be? Okay, taken theoretically, if you postulate this. So you rezone this as residential. A residential development takes place, and then a failure occurs.
Yeah, but that assessment would still have to be done. You can't do a residential development on this property until subdivision consent has been granted.
Yep.
And a prerequisite for that consent being granted is exactly the assessment that you're talking about.
You would still have to do the same work, though.
Oh, we're not. No one's denying that. That's the point. The risk only arises if you build a house absent this work being done.
Yeah.
Surely.
Well, even if you don't build a house, okay. So if you were to rezone it, then the first exercise you would have to do would be the work that you would need to do in order to exact a.
Well, exactly. That's the point we're trying to make.
But you've made that decision to rezone it then. So then the council would be having to accept some responsibility should there be a problem going forward. I think it's a planning issue essentially, and I think.
All right. Well, I think that's a subtly different issue about who bears the risk of things happening.
It is. It's down to that. I mean, that is sort of why we've got this process now.
All right.
Essentially.
Okay. Well, I don't think. Sorry, Mr. Cooney, I interrupted. I was keen to.
Yeah, you've answered my question. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, and I don't have any questions.
It is very esoteric, I know, but I mean these.
All right, no, thank you very much for your help.
These are the planning rules. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Warrington.
Yeah.
Ms. Campbell, sorry, you've been sitting on the sidelines for a while we had that conversation with Mr. Warrington. Could you just unshare your screen now, please, Mr. Warrington? I don't think we need that anymore.
Sorry. No, I'll do this.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, where's Ms. Campbell? There she is. Yeah. Ms. Campbell, what is there anything else that you want to highlight before we move on?
Yes, I thought I would just add briefly to that conversation. What we really need to do is come back to the subdivision rule in the residential zone. So I just want to draw your attention to 16.4.1, the subdivision rule.
Yes.
Now, essentially this discussion and the kind of questions that are coming towards John at the end are in relation to this subdivision rule. And the question is, do the matters of discretion, excuse me, provide for adequate assessment of the requirements that John is looking for? And I draw your attention to clause I, IV and V, which I think would come closest to providing for that assessment of geotechnical matters. It's just good to have that in the back of our minds when we're thinking, does this provide for that investigation process to happen?
In relation to this particular proposal, there'd be nothing stopping us from putting a specific caveat, if you like, on the criteria that would apply to Puketerini, given its unique set of circumstances, and say subdivision at Puketerini is subject to that rule plus the geotechnical rule, could it not?
Yes, no, I think you're right there. I've been basing my recommendation on the advice of John, and I think if he were to think that was appropriate, I would too.
Okay, all right. No, I think we've canvassed the issue, and we obviously need to hear from terra firma, and we need to put all that in the mix and figure out what the right answer is. But I don't think we can take it any further now with you or Mr. Warrington. So does that conclude your presentation, Ms. Campbell?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Is Mr. Muldowney present? Because I've clearly led him astray by saying he wouldn't be, well, I was correct in saying he wouldn't be on before 10 o'clock, but I was horribly astray in any inference that he might be on shortly thereafter.
Yes, thank you, sir. I am still here and have been checking in on proceedings. Our team has gone off and secured coffee and
well, that's fine. Look, we'll leave it to you, but I mean, we'll just have to play this by ear and see how long things take from here. Yeah. I won't be participating in the Genesis Energy submission for the reason that I've said before. I would have thought that would be fairly quick. Not so sure on the terra firma, so we're just going to have to play it by ear, I'm afraid.
No, that's perfectly fine, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We're now due to hear from Genesis. For the reasons I've said before, I'll leave you and Mr. Cooney and the rest of them.
Yes, Mr. Matthews.
Sorry, I just had to find my mute and video buttons to get them organised.
Right.
Yes, and look, I will try to be very brief comparatively because yeah, quite different matter here. If I could just start with talking about the scope issue that Ms. Campbell mentioned first in her presentation, as that may be something to hit the bench of mind before you actually even get to consider the substantive matters. If I go back, well, first of all, you'll see that the evidence that I've prepared for this hearing, the council, when posting it on the website for the Huntly zoning, posted it both under the further submitter section as well as under the original submitter section. So there's obviously a little bit of debate about where it actually sits now. In terms of scope, the Genesis Energy submission was quite clear about Chapter 4 urban environment, about seeking provisions for reverse sensitivity matters to do with significant infrastructure and the Huntly Power Station in particular. And there were several...
That was a generic type.
There were several specific references to the policy framework that applied to the urban environment. So basically talking about reverse sensitivity. Now, the medium density residential zone was not part of the notified plan. It was a proposal by Kainga Ora in their submission. So the only way that Genesis could make a submission in relation to a medium density zone provision was to lodge a further submission against that, which they did, again on the basis of potential reverse sensitivity matters. So what I'm saying is that how we've arrived at this point is through the original submission seeking provisions about reverse sensitivity, a submission seeking a zone change that brought into play a potential reverse sensitivity matter that Genesis then raised in its further submission. Now, when Genesis looked at that submission by Kainga Ora, they weren't opposed to medium density zone that was proposed. What they were saying is that there was one portion of that that would have a greater potential for reverse sensitivity matters, and they would like to suggest that. So rather than just support or oppose that position, what we've actually tried to do is to say, this is the piece that we're opposed to, and we're not even entirely opposed to it in that instance. There are some rules, if you choose to put those rules in place, there are some rules that could address that matter. So just by simply making it a restricted discretionary activity subject to some matters to be considered. So yes, strictly speaking, if you look at the broader scene, that wasn't asked for in a submission, but the ability to ask for it wasn't there because nobody had proposed this zone in the first place. It's trying to be helpful as to find a way through that. So if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, it is. Thank you. Are you able just to tell us what's the distance from the zone boundary to your site?
The Huntley Power Station zone goes down to the riverbank on the. Yes, that's a good question. I can't say exactly there. Just a minute, I should be. No, not a simple matter. It's probably in the order of about 1 kilometre. If I can come back to you on that, I will certainly answer that in a few minutes.
Could you do that? If it is
certainly before the end of this discussion, I can do that.
Yeah, if it is 1 kilometre, that's been pretty precautionary, aren't you?
It is being precautionary, and I think it's based on the main issue from Huntley Power Station in the past has been potential noise effects, and the issue being that noise seems to travel preferentially, if you like, across a water surface quite readily. So what we're talking about is, yes, it may be that distance apart, but at the same time, it's directly across a flat water surface, which helps to propagate that noise. So that's the logic.
Well, can you come back to us by the end of the day to tell us the distance, and also probably the estimated number of properties that might be affected? Is that possible?
Estimated number of properties that could be difficult.
It might be a bit hard, but within the MDRZ area, the area that would be affected by what you're seeking.
Yep. Certainly looking at Google Earth, my map would say it's just on 1 kilometre.
All right.
So I can certainly do an assessment of the number of properties and get back to you by the end of the day.
Yeah, the extent of what almost would be a sort of a form of overlay, probably over part of the medium density zone. So if you can just check that out.
I can see what I can do in that regard, and just identify the number of properties involved, their distances from the site.
Okay.
If that's it.
Okay. I'll just ask if the other commissioners have got any questions of you. Commissioners, Mr. Ward?
Nothing from me, thank you, Mr. Matthews.
Ms. Gibb?
Yes, I do have a couple of questions actually, and looking on your map, on the map, it does look like about 20 properties that's been circled in restricted discretionary area you're proposing, but I've just counted up the lots, but they might not be right. My concern is relativity really, because the main trunk line runs along on the back side of those properties, not the riverside, and that is, I would imagine, 100 metres or 200 metres from their boundaries. And so in my view, there'd be more noise from trains and even the cars, although it is no longer State Highway 1. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
You're certainly correct. I agree with you on several counts there. Yes, I think it is in the order of about 20 properties, and certainly the road behind and the railway behind are important factors as well. And that is why we've looked at only those riverbank properties, and so between the road and the river, because that's where the sound would propagate across the river. And I guess in terms of those other features, the potential Huntly Power Station noise is a lot more of a continuous low hum noise, and that's certainly the noise that's been there's been concern about in Huntly in the past, is the continual, I won't say drumming, but a continual hum, if you like, of the operation of the station. And that's the sort of thing that we think would be the determining factor for those properties along that riverbank bank side. And I think also, in addition to that, if you were building properties in that, building dwellings in that location, you are more likely to insulate, if you like, sound insulate against the railway line and the road that are pretty obviously right next door to you, but not think about the one right on the other side of the river. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that that's part of the mix as well. And that's all it is just to say, recognise that this is on the other side of the river as well, to take account of.
And just one more question. So you've said Huntly people have noticed this hum. Like, I would have thought that a hum you get used to, or a constant noise you get used to, as opposed to the one-off train that goes by, although I know you get used to that as well. But how many, or do you know how many complaints you've had, and of what nature is specific?
I can't answer that because I'm not aware of the specific details recently, but there's two things that I would note. One is the way in which the power station has operated has changed over the years, so that it's not a continuous hum continuous every day in the winter, like it once was when it first started. So that aspect of operation has changed, may change the level of sound or noise that's heard in Huntly. The second thing that I note is that a few years ago there was a cooling tower built along the riverbank front edge of the power station. Now that is used in summer for cooling extra water flows from the Waikato River, or the river flows, so that the station can actually operate during low flows and high river temperatures. The presence of that structure has also altered the sound profile, if you like, coming from the station, because the main noise producing activities are now behind that building. When it operates, I think people now say that they can hear water flowing, which they didn't used to hear before because of the water that flows through the cooling tower. So those are matters that have changed what has happened. So complaint received may actually not be necessarily a measure of what you see. In this instance, where we're talking about new development, it's people coming in where they haven't been there previously, and hear the noise in their new dwelling and start to say, well, what's that about, and what do we do about it? Now, if we can stop that in the first place by saying it needs to be designed to account for that, then we're okay. And that's why we're saying a restricted discretionary activity is okay. It's not saying don't do it, it's saying do it, but under the appropriate conditions.
All right, thanks, Mr. Matthews. Thank you. No more questions.
Ms. Sedgwick?
The majority of my questions have just been asked and answered, but I forgive me that I couldn't find what the decibel measurement was. What, is there an acoustic layer? that's done. I was quite excited when I saw that it was at a distance, but clearly I do take your point that sound travels over water. So has the...
Look, the Huntly Power Station industrial zone must meet within the notional boundary in the rural zone. I can't remember if it's 40 or 45, but it's whatever the rural zone noise limits are. It must meet that at the notional boundary, but it must meet whatever the residential zone noise standards are. So that's what has to be met in that within that zone. Now, noises like a continuous hum and so can often meet that standard, but not necessarily. It can still be annoying, if you like, to people who live there. And that's what reverse sensitivity is often about. It's not that you're not complying with the standard. It's actually people saying, what's the fuss? What are you going to do about it? Why don't you make that noise go away? And the only way you can make it go away is to stop operating the station.
Thank you.
Commissioner Fulton?
Yeah, no, I have no questions. Thank you very much. I think we've pretty well been answered.
Okay. Thank you. I think you've given us the answers that I wanted. There's about 1 kilometre and about 20 properties. Is that right, Mr. Matthew?
That's the order of magnitude. I would have to note there is a qualification to that. And that will be that's at the northern end of the area that I've identified. So you could probably add another 100 metres, 200 metres on to the southern end as well. So it's in that order. So, it's at least 1 kilometre.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Chair, you can come back in now.
Thank you. That's good timing because I just walked through the door and heard you finishing up. So very good. I wonder whether we shouldn't take a 15-minute break before we start here with the terra firma case. No one has any objection to that. It may take a little while, and I think it's better to hear the terra firma scenario from start to finish in one go. So unless there's any violent objection, we'll adjourn and come back at 11:05. Thank you. If you wouldn't mind. Welcome back, everybody. We're ready to resume. We're ready to hear from the terra firma folk now. Thank you.
Okay.
Just before we do that, Mr. Smith, and before you start, obviously, as I've said at the outset, we've read the background material pretty carefully. We understand the background. You've appeared at earlier hearings as well. So we're pretty well appraised of what it is you want to do and why. There's really only one issue that we're sort of collectively grappling with, and that's the geotechnical issue and how that plays out in a planning sense. So to the extent that you're able to focus on those aspects in your presentation to us, we're happy to take the other matters as read and just ask any questions if we have them. But obviously you're free to highlight whatever other points you want to, but they're the ones that seem to us that are sort of central to this. There's nothing much of a contentious nature on the other aspect. So we'll leave it with you with that thought in mind.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I commence, may I just ask, had Michael Carter, our geotech engineer, he wasn't online when we made our introductions earlier. Can we ask him to just provide a brief introduction?
Certainly, I can see him there. Just need to turn your sound on, Mr. Carter. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I'm Michael Carter. I'm a consulting engineering geologist. I conducted the very preliminary geotechnical assessments of the sites. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, as you've guided us, Mr. Chairman, I've no intention of covering any other issues other than the obvious one that's before us. I think my time is best spent trying to fill in some of the mining gaps to help the commissioners understand how this land came to be. It's been referred to as a tailings dam, and I think that's very misleading. The tailings dam, which is often attached to gold mining operations, typically is a much different beast, and behaves a lot differently and presents a whole lot more difficulties in terms of rehabilitation and future land use. The Puketirani land comprises all the overburden that was mined out over the many years that Weaver's mine was in operation. The number 8 bund, which has been spoken about today at length, was constructed to protect the final mine workings from the spoil that have been deposited, and also to provide final part of the overall stability of the site. State Coal Mines, which operated the mine for its entire period up until corporatisation in 1987, they contracted Ministry of Works to design the dam. And as you're probably aware, Ministry of Works was the preeminent dam designer and constructor, and renowned for their belt and braces methodology. And State Coal Mines also had a reputation for doing things to a very high standard. So commercial considerations would not have entered the decision making at the time. So the Weaver's operation mined a number of seams, and the overburden above the seams and between the seams was blasted and carted into the previously mined areas. We acknowledge that the material in this part of the country is a mixture of hard material and soft material, and particularly in winter periods when there's a lot of rain, the soft material does present challenges. And typically the operation would be to impound the soft material within hard material ponds, and then for that material to dry out and then be trafficked over, and then further overburden be placed on top. So to a large extent, it was an engineered type of construction, although we haven't claimed in our evidence that it's an engineered fill, although we strongly claim that the number 8 bund is a heavily engineered structure that was designed to be fit to do what it did at the time of mining and post-mining. I'm a mining engineer, graduated from Otago in 1971. I've had 50 years experience in coal mining, in underground and open cast operations. Had no involvement with the Weaver's mine. I moved to Huntly in 1999, and then the mine had been finished operation. It was in the rehabilitation phase, and there was a little puddle at the bottom as the mine was the lake was finally starting to be filled. We purchased the land based on our assessment that the land was stable, and I think that's an important point. There's absolutely no evidence that the land is unstable despite its history, and that's our starting point of our discussion. We acknowledge that it's a unique situation as far as the council is concerned. It's not usual for previously mined areas to be built on, but we maintain that the material we're proposing to build on here is no different than the vast majority of the Waikato. It's the same rocks that have been disturbed, but have been put in place, and many years have passed with the preloading of the material, allowing the overburden to consolidate and finally settle. There's no evidence that the land has settled or is still settling. And while we propose and have right from the outset, we were looking for ways of determining how we do that. In our submission, as you've discussed at length, we submit that final assessment take place following the rezoning decision, so that we've got confidence to carry out the future work. We've, as a company, we've got absolutely no ambition to do anything which is unsafe, and we won't be commencing the development or subdivision until we're personally satisfied, regardless of the council's position, until we're personally satisfied that it's a safe course of action to take. What else do I need to say? Yeah, I suppose the only other thing is that we think the land is a beautiful situation. It's all north facing. We don't intend to carry out any major earthworks to disturb the land as it's currently situated, other than that's required for infrastructure. And yeah, our objective is to create a high value subdivision, if you like, that will be attractive for the Huntly district and for the Waikato. That's all I wish to say, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to take as many questions as you have.
Thanks, Mr. Smith. I think what we might do is carry on and get to the end, and then we might ask questions of you as a group, given that all the issues are probably interrelated. So we'll just ask you to carry on, and if it makes sense to pause it after one of the statements, then we will. But I think our working hypothesis is that we'll get to the end, and then we'll just ask you collectively the questions, and you can figure out how best to respond.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yep.
Thank you. Sorry, are you waiting for us? We're ready when you're ready. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll take much of my summary as read, as it's clear that we are just focusing on the one issue today. But I suppose to foreshadow our intention, and Mr. Smith will talk more about that later, to address this issue of the geotech work that needs to be done through a specific subdivision rule. We are already proposing a new restricted discretionary rule for subdivision at Puketurani to allow a minimum lot size of 450 square metres. And one option is to beef up those requirements to specifically address the geotechnical investigation that needs to be done as part of that process. So we can have a discussion about that later. Just a couple more things really. Just in terms of the minutes that we've had a couple of meetings with John Warrington and co to discuss our position on this, and we saw those minutes last night, and really just to confirm our position that we are in agreement that more work needs to be done, and that was the intention that we thought we'd put across at the meeting. We don't agree that more work needs to be done before rezoning, so I think that's why we're all here today. And really the only other matter I thought I'd just cover off is the further submissions by Waikato Regional Council and Mercury, just flagging that they are not, in our opinion, justifying a delay on the rezoning decision. We've effectively addressed Waikato Regional Council's concerns about geotech matters. We will be through this revised rule, and Mercury's concerns about flood risk, don't really affect the site. A small defended area located to the north near the lake, and although we are some way away from the stop banks which are purported to protect that defended area, we could easily raise the ground level at that point to make sure we're above any area that might present a flood risk. So neither of those submission points appear to be an impediment to a rezoning decision. So and I'll hand on to the next person and look forward to the discussions at the end.
All right, thank you, Ms. Smith.
That will be Mr. Vink.
Morning all.
Morning.
I'm a civil environmental engineer. We sort of did an initial assessment of Three Waters. Mr. Chairman, do you see any value, given the focus on geotech, to run through sort of stormwater and wastewater?
I think we're happy to take your written material as read, and if we have any questions, because we have read it, I think it's pretty straightforward from that point of view. There's no real contention in anything that you've said, but if there is anything you want to highlight, feel free to do so.
I would agree. There's no real contention. It's fundamentally can be serviced and have no adverse effects on the environment or the lake environment. So I'm happy to support.
Look, I think we're content to leave it at that, and if we have any questions on what we've read, we'll ask at the conclusion.
Thank you, sir.
So as long as you're happy with that, I think we are as well.
Yep, no problem.
Thank you.
And Michael Carter will follow.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning all.
Morning.
I'm going to try and keep what I'm about to say fairly brief and then rely on questions, because so far I note that many of the questions from the panel have been very appropriate, and I will respond accordingly. So I'm going to start with my conclusion and get that out of the way. So I've actually written this, but based on my studies, my observation, etc., I am going to say with a 75% degree of certainty that I expect that the larger portion of the Puketereni site, subject to appropriate further geotechnical investigation, will be found to be suitable for residential construction. And if anyone was to ask me, is this project still worth pursuing? I would say definitely yes. Now, I want to explain why I advise my clients to begin with just bearing capacity. Well, it is a fundamental requirement in supporting buildings. So clearly, we found that the bearing capacity was inadequate, then it might have been a signal to can the project. Whereas a bearing capacity problem can usually be overcome through what we call specific engineering design of foundations, there's a limit to that, which is it's limited by economics. So I have to, as a professional, always take into account the economics of a project. And the main reason I restricted the investigation to just bearing capacity is that an essential component of an investigation was going to be settlement monitoring. And settlement monitoring takes time. We need to be able to measure whether the land surface is still moving vertically, horizontally, or somewhere in between. Now, in this day and age, we have very accurate instruments where we can, I'm not a surveyor, but I expect that we can measure down to under a centimetre per year in movement. So my clients have already in place a grid of datum points which are being measured over time. The second reason was that I quickly began to understand that a conventional type of investigation was not going to be fully appropriate due to the nature of the materials in the subsurface and their mix. So I agree almost entirely with what Mr. Warrington has stated in terms of his concerns. But there were questions asked about density of boreholes and what is the current situation in New Zealand. Now, we have this guideline from, who is it, MBIE and GNS. Now, Mr. Warrington is correct that we use this in our investigations with discretion. Why? First off, it was written specifically for the Canterbury region in response to the Christchurch earthquake. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't use it, and it's been acknowledged by its authors that it's being used to a degree in various other regions. But if we look at earthquake risk as defined by GNS, then we will find that Canterbury, Wellington, East Coast, North Island is ranked amongst the highest in terms of earthquake risk, whereas the Huntly region is, as I recall, the second lowest risk of earthquake in New Zealand, the lowest risk being Northland. So, density of test sites. The current situation is that it's left to the discretion of the engineer. And if councils have concern over the result of our analysis, they put our work up for peer review. That's the process. Now, why is it left to the discretion of the engineer? Because that is what we are expected to do, and we are the people who sign the bottom line. We take all the risk and all the liability. Furthermore, our qualifications and our registration, particularly with Engineering New Zealand, is an extremely important factor. Becoming a chartered member of Engineering New Zealand is not an easy path. It's a long, tedious, difficult path. So that, I think, hopefully will answer your question about density of boreholes. If we have a site which we believe, according to our experience, our training, our studies, our testing, is very consistent, then we might put a small number of boreholes in. If I was drilling in Hamilton for a commercial building, knowing that it has a tendency for peat lenses and so on, then if I was involved, I would be saying, okay, we need a higher density, maybe higher than what is recommended by this document. If you just give me a moment, and I'll just check my list. We need to differentiate between the backfill debris and the bund, particularly in relation to how we test. Now, normally we can rely on the results from a borehole to give us a reasonable indication on, let's call it the weakest zone, potential failure zone within a slope. But the mixture causes two problems. One is the actual operation of drilling. It's going to be very challenging for a driller because they're going to be drilling through a mix of materials ranging from hard rock to soft clay. And normally one can judge the materials to a point by studying what we call the drill cuttings. But this is not a very robust method of checking subsurface properties. When we add the complexity of the subsurface and the fact that the results from one borehole may be quite different from another that's 5 meters away, means that we have to start thinking outside the square. So where does this all start? It starts with studying the original strata and the properties of that strata. And we have means of doing this. Within half a kilometre of the Weaver's Pit is another open pit. I've observed it from aerial imaging, and we have an opportunity to go in there and actually study the materials that make up the backfill. And I'm going to say that according to my current understanding, that 80% of the material that was deposited as, I'll call it backfill, debris, is highly suitable as engineering fill. One in particular, I called it the Hinuera sequence type gravelly sand, is the single most important aggregate used under concrete slabs in the Waikato. Much of the remainder is crushed hard siltstone, limestone, hard greywacke rock. And admittedly, within that sequence, there are minor beds of weak material. And then surrounding the coal seam, we have the gremlin, which is what the miners call fire clay. We call it, it's called the Glenafton clay. This is a very weak material, especially when disturbed. So we don't know exactly how this was mixed into the strong material. But I will say at this point in time that it would constitute 20% or less of the material that is in the backfill. Now, when it's mixed adequately with all the strong material, it's reinforced. So I'll leave that there. I just want to quickly go to the bund. I want to make a couple of points about the bund. And again, it's just purely my expectation at this point in time. I agree with Mr. Warrington that we need to fully characterise this bund. And we do this through drilling and through other means. However, I doubt that it's built fully from fire clay. That doesn't make sense to me. It's not a good construction material. It's probably highly susceptible to swelling and shrinkage. And I would expect that if we look at the diagram, which says fire clay, it's got an arrow that points to one slope layer, and that it could relate to sealing the bund, and that much of the bund core could actually be constructed of strong material. Now, to throw something else into the mix, this is just a consideration, and if I was doing this geotechnical report, I would bring on board a dam engineer. I would not attempt to fully characterize this bund without a specialist. But here's one little conclusion. Two, actually. The bund was built to protect investment, plant, and people. Now that's high risk. So I would ask you to consider that the engineers that built that, their consideration of risk, was it any lower than our consideration of risk? That's point one. I would think that their consideration of risk would be very high. Point two, I would expect that the bund, the top of the bund, is actually on the land surface, and it's not fully immersed in water. That's my expectation. Now, take into account the bund is built to withstand all the pressure of the materials that are placed behind it. Now we have a situation where it's supported by water on its lakeside slope. Now, water is half the density of rock material. Therefore, the simple logic of that is now the bund is supporting half the force that it was designed to support. Now, this one last thing, yes, it's possible that that water has permeated into the bund and weakened it. It's something we would need to check. So I think I will leave it at that for the moment and just wait for any questions. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Carter. We'll do the questions at the end. I think we're going to hear from Mr. Smith, Mr. Lincoln Smith now. Thanks, Mr. Smith.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm going to run through this reasonably quickly, so we stay on time. I've got, I guess, five key points to summarise where we are. I think the key aspect is the number 8 bund is an engineered structure. It was designed by the Ministry of Works, preeminent dam engineers at the time. The overburden that has been placed behind the bund is the same sedimentary rocks that are found throughout the Huntly region. It'll be a mixture of strength, as Mr. Carter has said. The material has been subjected to initial compaction, if you like, through the mining processes, and then more importantly has been subjected to 30 years of time-based compaction. Terra Firma has agreed and stated throughout the process that we need to carry out additional work to satisfy ourselves and all the other stakeholders that a subdivision can be built in the area. But I think, as we all acknowledge, the site is unique, and a conventional solution or a conventional geotechnical investigation may not be appropriate, and a unique sort of solution is required. I guess we are, as an organisation or as a company, happy to have a conditional rezoning based on further geotechnical work. How that might play out and how that might work, I don't know. But I think I can leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Let's see if the panel has any questions of you. Can we start with you, Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just a couple. Are you able to tell us, was it always planned that the lake would be filled with water? I mean, was it, my understanding was the lake was left, but was it always planned that that would happen?
Yes, yeah. The ultimate conclusion of mining and rehabilitation was that there would be recontoured land and rehabilitated land and a lake at the bottom. Okay.
Just on your plan, and I know you're applying just for half of your property at the moment. That's just an arbitrary line drawn across between the rural and the subdivision that you're applying for. Is that correct? Is that based on anything because of geotech analysis of the land further up?
Yes, the surface or the crustal investigation work that we completed indicated some softer areas on that side of the property.
So, okay, so you at this stage you've just concentrated on the lower end, but it's an arbitrary line.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Good.
Thank you, Ms. Cedric.
I do have, pardon me, a question, and that's, I'm still trying to get myself clear on the bund issue, or the bund question. So that was, am I correct in understanding that that was designed by the Ministry of Works?
Yes, you are.
So, but it would be helpful if you had the plans or the evidence as to what was the various stages of it being built, and are they not available anymore?
Yeah, we have obtained we've obtained some of those plans. I guess one of the critical aspects that we want to verify is you have a design, and we have that, and then we need to verify that it's been constructed to that design. That evidence we don't have yet, and we want to be able to go and either verify that it was constructed as per the design, or the investigation work that we need to do to demonstrate that it's fit for purpose.
So from the image that I think it was Mr. Warrington showed, it showed it being built in stages, 85, 86, etc., etc. So one would assume that they'd signed off at each stage, if you like, so there's nothing of that either.
I'm sure
there will be compliance or whatever you call it.
Yeah, we don't have that evidence now. Yeah. The bund and the overburden was designed to be placed sequentially with the mining. So the bund was constructed, then overburden was placed, and then a next lift or a next layer on the bund was constructed, and additional overburden was placed. Yeah. And
can you explain to me why is fire clay not so strong? Or is what's
fire clay is a clay that's found throughout the Huntly region.
The brick type clay.
Yeah, so it's not Huntly brick clay. It's different to that, but it doesn't react well with water. I share Mr. Carter's opinion that I don't believe that the bund will have been constructed out of fire clay, but it is often used as a surface membrane, if you like, to try and seal the bund. Yeah.
What happens when it meets water?
Well, it's a weak material and it can erode. Yeah.
And some of the bund covering is actually now underwater, if like the 85, 86. Okay.
Yes, okay. Yes, that's correct. So the north side of the bund is submerged. The crown of the bund is still on surface.
Yep.
And of course, the southern edge of the bund is beneath all the overburden. So the north side of the bund is a relatively flat face.
Yep.
So it runs out under the water, under the lake. Yeah, there's no historical evidence of slippage or erosion in that area. The trees that were on that northern face of the bund, which is now underwater, are still standing and visible from above the lake.
Right. And just finally, the settlement monitoring grid, when was that put down?
About 3 months ago, 4 months ago. Yeah,
so
recently. So we need some time.
Right. So is there any? How long have you owned the land?
18 months.
Okay. I was just
3 years. Yeah.
Looking for any anecdotal, from your perspective, any anecdotal evidence of.
Well, anecdotal evidence. We've been involved through various capacities, whether it's running around the lake or part of the rehabilitation for the last 20 years. And we've had discussions with previous graziers and farmers in the area. There's no evidence at all of slumping, settlement, fences moving, anything of that capacity. But that's I guess a nice anecdotal evidence. What we need to do now is get some hard data to verify what we think's there.
Yes, I think you're quite right. Hard data and evidence is needed. Sorry, did somebody else have something to say there?
So.
In which case, I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's just one thought that's going through my mind, and there was a discussion between one of the engineers and our chairman about what comes first, the zoning or the testing, and we've all decided, we're listening to everybody agreeing that you have to do it anyway, and you would do it anyway. So what's your view on that? Because in my head, it seems that we can identify it as residential, and then if the testing doesn't come out the way you want it to, it would obviously not be built upon. Isn't zoning it residential indicating that we're all okay with it and people will assume it's okay? And that was one of the points someone raised, and I just would like to hear your views on that, please.
Well, I don't think we can assume anything, and that's what this process is about. We would like the land rezoned, and that will give us sufficient confidence to carry on with the investigations. The investigations, should it bear sufficient evidence to demonstrate that it's as we think it is now, that's a fantastic result. But it could say it requires some other engineering which will influence some design characteristics or design requirements for a subdivision. So an area might need some additional stabilization, it might not. So for me, it's we do the investigation to provide certainty, and we do the investigation to influence ultimate design. Does that make sense?
Yes, like in my head, and it hasn't been brought up at all in this hearing, but in other hearings, we've talked about future urban zones, which means that as commissioners, we think they're appropriate for urbanisation, but that obviously that would require detailed work done and plan changes in the future. And to me, it all seems that all of those options are on the table in front of us. And that's why I was just wondering what your opinion was. Obviously, you just want live zoning. And either way, the money has to be spent, in my opinion, looking at the problem in front of everybody.
Yeah. Craig would like to say a word.
I think it's a question of confidence and risk. I think that there's nothing that we have discovered so far, either from our researching the mining records or the engineering work we've had done to date, there's nothing that suggests that the land is not going to be found suitable. So that's one point. The second point is the confidence issue. This gathering of data that Lincoln talked about, it may take 2 or 3 or more years to get sufficient data points for us to agree that we can proceed. And we don't want to be hanging out there at that point, then having to go for a rezoning. You know, we're going to do this, as you say, the work will either be done before or after, but yeah, it's a confidence issue about are we putting all this money before the cart before the horse? There's no evidence that yet that says that it's a high risk activity. We think all the evidence is that it's low risk, and that we're asking the commissioners to sort of rule on that basis, but we're not looking to change our whatever we might agree with in terms of what's the appropriate investigation and appropriate milestones to get to before we commence the subdivision.
Right, so you're in it, and you're not in it to do it tomorrow. You're in it to get all the information, and you're in it for the long haul.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, look, we love the place, and we're not about to do anything which is risky to anybody, and that's sort of what we're asking for in a way. We don't know about those estimates that Mr. Warrington talked about before. He may be close, or he may be out. We need to understand that, and the project might stand that sort of expense. But we don't want to spend the money until with having the uncertainty of whether it's going to get rezoned subsequently.
Okay,
we'd like that beforehand.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Mark.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I just thought I might just add a note.
Sorry, Ms. Smith. Yeah, by all means.
bit of just a comment there about a couple of options perhaps for addressing this issue, which we sort of flagged, and one of them is a live zoning with a beefed up subdivision consent rule, which is specific about the nature and timing for further investigations. And another one, I'm not entirely clear that this will be possible, is a conditional zoning subject to similar investigations being undertaken with a prescribed suite of what needs to be ticked off and some timeframes around those. So that's just a couple of ways. Obviously, we prefer a live zoning and a subdivision rule that applies. And as Craig says, there's no indication that investigations won't show that the site isn't suitable. And so I suppose we believe that that would be an appropriate option for this site.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Mark?
No actual questions for the Terra Firma team, but thank you very much. But I would like to clarify something with Mr. Warrington, Mr. Chair, if I can.
I think you might. Oh no, he is still there. Yes. Far away.
Yeah, I'm here. Yep.
Yeah, Mr. Warrington, going back to the MB guideline that you talked about at length and provided detail on, are you able to confirm whether that guideline is mandatory or not?
It's good practice, shall we say. It's come from good engineering practice, and it's emanated from the experience of Christchurch. That's what it's been based on. But it's been produced by New Zealand Geotechnical Society and the Ministry for Business, and yeah, it's only recent. So you're looking within the last 5 years that it's come through, but there are good reasons for it, basically, in terms of protecting everybody's interests. And say with that Christchurch experience, where areas had been zoned for housing that could be considered in retrospect as being inappropriate, with knowledge that might have been available prior to it being zoned, would not have been rezoned as housing. Basically, that's where this has come from, in essence, and that is now what is being applied. So this is being applied generally by those of us in the geotechnical engineering discipline now. So it's I wouldn't say it's absolutely mandatory, no, but it's recognised as being good practice.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and in terms of it protects everybody's interests. Myself as a professional, and the district council are somebody who's responsible for plan zoning, and I mean the landowners themselves, basically, in terms of protecting their interests, essentially. Ahead of that rezoning taking place, it's in everybody's interest, essentially.
Thank you. And would you concur with Mr. Carter in the relationship of your 1 in 500 event? He stated that Huntly is the second lowest risk area.
It is. Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. Yeah,
very
absolutely right, Mr. Carter. Yeah. But having said that, I mean, the ULS, it's equivalent to what's called related to acceleration, gravity, force gravity, and for the Huntly area, it's of the order of about 0.25 G. So it's not insignificant. That's for the ULS design earthquake, the 1 in 500 year earthquake. And so that's going to introduce a significant force into the ground. There's a lot of the evidence that has been presented relates to consolidation settlement and settlement points of the fill material. Whilst that can be an issue, and that is being monitored, and it's suggested will continue to be monitored, and that there has been settlement of that material that forms the the fill behind the bund and of the bund itself. In essence, the key thing here is the overall stability, slope stability, if you like, lateral stability of that whole earth structure for that seismic event. Really, that's where we're coming from with this, and the ground investigation that's going to be needed in order for us to undertake that assessment of that stability, to have confidence to say that yes, this site is going to be able to withstand a 1 in 500 earthquake with that level of acceleration of 0.25 G, and that slope be stable and not cause a problem for that whole area, basically.
Thank you very much for that. No other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cooney? You're on mute, Mr. Cooney, sorry.
You hear me now?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, this site, it's got a red light over it, and I don't think anyone disputes that care is required if residential development proceeds on the site. It seems what we're trying to do is to say to you, well, how do you address the problem? And I can understand you don't want to spend the money at this point before it is rezoned, unless there's some certainty that the rezoning will eventuate. Commissioner Gibb has raised the issue of a future urban zone. Isn't that a viable option if it's worded properly, that would provide you with some certainty that if you can clear these geotech hurdles, then it can be deemed to be suitable for future development? Is that something you've looked at, and if so, what's your response to that?
Well, we did look at a future urban zone as one of the options for Puketuruni, and I think at that point the conclusion was that the investigations that needed to be done were the same regardless of what the zoning was, and a future urban zone would just sort of delay the process of getting houses on the ground. And I think I was of the understanding that the future urban zone was to be applied where council knew as much as they had for residential rezoning. It was just a not to be used where there was sort of some outstanding technical issues, but as a, yes, we know it's over the line and it can happen down the track. However, if we could tweak it to be sort of suitable for this site and to have some tags on environmental and geotechnical investigations that are specific. So we could, potentially use a future urban zone in this context, and perhaps not in the same way it's been used elsewhere in the district.
Yeah, it'd be specially tailored to the particular site. Yeah, okay. Because there is, and I think it was a good point raised by Commissioner Gibb, the very act of zoning this residential does give a general signal that it's appropriate for residential use, and we really don't know that yet, and that's the real issue we're grappling with. So that's why I think we're exploring all these options.
Yes, as are we. It's hard to find the ideal solution that is perfect for the site when we still are finding some information. But I think to speak to Mr. Smith's earlier point that nothing to date has shown that it could be for residential purposes. So we're proceeding with that sort of degree of confidence already. So we are in that sort of point of deciding what might be the best way to skin this particular cat.
All right. Thanks very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I've only got one question, and because the others have all been asked and answered, and it was really a question for Mr. Carter, where he said, and I wrote it down, that in relation to these future assessments, he said the engineer takes all the risk, and he then went on to explain the certification process and all those sorts of things, and engineering registration, if it's still called that, etc., etc. But I wonder if it's a little bit more complicated than that, Mr. Carter, insofar as it's one thing to say your reputation and professional indemnity insurance is on the line if you make a bum call, as it were, and despite the best intentions and the quality of work, the land fails, you know, there's a slip and so forth. Usually in those circumstances, the person that's responsible for that disappears at high speed and either ceases to practice or deregisters themselves. And I think we're all aware of examples where that's happened. And then it is left largely to the regulatory authority to pick the pieces up. Do you have any comment on that?
Yes, I am fully aware of this. And I can fully appreciate that. I'll shoot from the hip in terms of this issue. I've said to my clients, just take, for example, this is trying to understand things from council's point of view. Media get hold of a story that's rightly or wrongly, dwellings are going to be built on mine tailings behind a dam. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not too worried about what the media says. I'm worried about the scenario where you've said the engineer takes all the risk, and the proposition I'm putting to you is that that's not correct, because in the event of the unexpected, if I could put it that way, happening, the engineer's professional indemnity insurance and professional registration usually fall by the wayside when the liabilities in the millions and millions and millions. And there's plenty of examples where things go boom, and it's the regulatory authority that granted approval that's sitting at the bottom picking up all the pieces after the engineer's long gone. That's the proposition I'm putting to you.
Okay, so I honestly can't speak for all engineers, but I can speak.
No, I'm not asking you to.
I'm speaking for myself, and that is, regardless of whether other parties feel that they're liable, I take the attitude that I am fully liable. I am fully responsible. Okay.
All right.
So
okay. Look, I understand that. That's what you said before. I don't think a further answer along those lines is particularly helpful. I understand that you would do your damnedest and all those sorts of things in your professional integrity.
Absolutely.
But at the end of the day, you might be one man standing against the world, and despite your best intentions, you could be left stranded, as could the council.
Yes, I fully understand that.
All right. No, that's fine. I don't have any further questions. Thank you. And I think that brings us to the end of the terra firma case. Is that right?
That's all we have to say on the matter.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time. Thanks for the presentations that you've given us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Which brings us to Shan Properties, Mr. Muldowney. We're only 2 hours and 2 minutes beyond the very poor estimate I gave you at the start of the hearing. So my apologies for that.
No apology necessary, sir. I fully understand the process that we're in, and we're just very happy to now have the full attention of the committee.
Just before you start, though, I guess it's the comment that was made in relation to the previous submitter, where the issues are quite narrow.
Yes.
You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 witnesses, I believe, plus yourself. We're pretty happy to take most of that written evidence as read, because there seems to be no issue around things. Obviously, there's some questions around ecology and planning. To the extent that your other witnesses need to comment on things, we're happy for them to do so. But it's not that helpful to us for people to spend time getting to the end and saying, I don't believe there's any issues. Council staff saying, we agree there are no issues, when that's the case. So we'll just leave you with that thought and ask you to proceed, please.
Yes, well, just on that point, sir, I mean, the intention was that each of the witnesses have obviously prepared a written statement, and
yes,
within the written statement there is an executive summary, and the consensus was that it seems efficient and responding to your indications, if we just simply take the witnesses to the executive summary and they can read those. But even then, you know, there is a fair degree of what you might call uncontentious evidence, it seems, even within those written statements. So I think if each witness goes to their executive summary and reads it, but if at any stage you think that even that is redundant, please let us know, and we can certainly cut to it. But that was the intended way that we go about presenting.
No, that's fine.
Okay. So before we begin with the evidence, I just wanted to make some opening statements. There has been, of course, legal submissions presented, and those are in writing before you.
Yes.
I don't intend to read from those submissions. They'll be with you, and I'm sure you've had an opportunity to read them. What I did want to do was just use the slide deck that had been forwarded to the hearing manager and make some initial comments with reference to the slide deck. So I wonder if, I think it was Fletcher, if he's able to drive the slide deck, and if we could bring that up on the screen, and I'll just speak to that if I may.
Yep, that's fine, thank you.
What I wanted to do in terms of the opening comments, I think, was really just focus firstly on making sure that everyone is clear on what the Shand interests are seeking in terms of the outcome, because it has evolved slightly from the original submissions. I just want to walk through that carefully.
Yeah, I think you can do that quite quickly because we are aware, but I think you summarise what it is, not what it was.
Yeah, well, I think probably if we go to slide 2 in the deck, you can see that firstly that helps, I think, probably just to locate all of the panel in terms of where we are in relation to Huntley. You can see there's the East Mine Road, which is really the northern extent of urbanisation within Huntley. And you can see the beginnings of the expressway being formed up in the top right-hand corner. So you can sort of see the general location, which I think should be familiar to everyone. The Shand interest, or the Shand property, is outlined in blue, and that's a very extensive area. But the submission now is simply seeking zoning changes in relation to what looks like a sort of orange to red hatched area in the sort of top left-hand corner closest to the river. And then you'll see down towards the bottom of East Mine Road, you'll see a hatched blue-green area, which is the other area which is sought to be rezoned. If we flip forward to slide deck, or slide 5, you can see that's the industrial area, which is identified there in purple. And you can see that that's the full extent has now been reduced to 16.77 hectares. And then if we move forward to, I think probably the best one would be slide 9. Going on more.
It's got area 6 on the top of it, that one.
Yeah, that one there. You can see the area in red is outlined as the residential area. So 2 distinct areas. There's the industrial area and there's the residential area. I don't think, as I'll take your signal, I don't think anyone is at all confused now about.
Yeah, well, we're all over that detail, Mr. Muldowney, so I think you can press on.
All right. In terms of the second point I wanted to address was just really the strategic land use context within which this sits, and probably the best place to go to would be slide 4 for this, because what it does is it just helps to illustrate just how neatly the proposed zoning requests sit within some of the strategic thinking that Waikato District has been working on. So these images show the Waikato 2070 intended growth areas for this part of Huntly. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's a very significant swathe of industrial land that's been identified in Waikato's own strategic growth instrument as being transformed into industrial land. And you can see the red dotted line of the proposed area which sits within it. So that just illustrates the point that what Shand is asking for is totally aligned with what Waikato 2070 is intending for this land resource. And then equally on the right-hand image, you can see the same thing where the proposed residential land sits within the orange area, which is already identified in Waikato 2070 as being the medium density residential. It's worth just noting on that image, there is that squiggly red dotted line, and what that red dotted line is depicting is the Section 42A author's proposed boundary for the residential area. So the 42A author is suggesting that that land that's, you might call it to the south of the red dotted line and closer to the already existing urban area, that is to be zoned as residential, whereas the orange areas above the red dotted line are proposed to be retained as rural zone. And that's obviously probably the one really single area of contention that remains between the planners that would like to explore with you. So as I say, that's the sort of the strategic context. The only other point I wanted to make about the strategic context was that in light of the recent Oheniwai decision, the panel might be interested in the question of where this fits into that potential change or signal change in terms of Oheniwai. And I think it's fair to say that from the Shan's perspective, they see this proposed rezoning as being entirely complementary of what's happening in Oheniwai. This rezoning of industrial land and residential land to the immediate north of the existing urban area in Huntly Township will strengthen Huntly, and it will certainly strengthen the industrial and residential land offering. And in that sense will become, I think, complementary to what's going on in Oheniwai. To the extent that Oheniwai gets away some industrial development in its first stage and doesn't necessarily get away any of the residential because of some of the relatively significant infrastructure triggers that will be in play with that component of the Oheniwai development, the residential land supply that can be brought to the market as part of the Shand proposal in Huntly, I think will be a very useful and complementary land use outcome, which sits nicely side by side with Oheniwai. And probably the only other comment I want to make about the Oheniwai development is that just in terms of the spatial extent of what's going on in Huntly, this sort of natural and organic extension of Huntly to the north, which this proposal offers, really sees the sort of distance and the gap, if you like, between Oheniwai and Huntly narrowing, so it's improving the sort of the connectedness and the connectivity of the two urban cells, and in that sense, I think starts to play out in terms of the NPS around what well-functioning urban environments look like. So overall, we see the outcome of the Oheniwai proposed plan change as being complementary to what is being promoted by the Shands and Huntley. That's a new submission. That's not something that was addressed in my legal submissions, and I'm happy to explore any questions on that topic if that's appropriate now, or we can leave it to planners, or however you wish to.
I think what we'll do, Mr. Muldowney, is do what we did with terra firma, given that there's very little in contention, is hear from the witnesses one by one, and then if there are any questions, we'll tend to ask them at the end of the overall presentation. But if there's something that's specific that pops up, like perhaps ecology or whatever, we might pause and do that at the time. But I think we'll press on and hear from the witnesses. Thanks.
All right,
if we've
that's
got any
fine.
questions, you can chip in with the answers as needed, I think. So I think what you've said is pretty clear.
Okay, thank you, sir. The only other thing I wanted to just identify before we hand over to the witnesses was just what I think are probably the remaining live planning issues that I think may become the focus of your inquiry, certainly as I see it. I mean, I think the first was there was a little bit of skirmishing between experts in relation to flooding and stormwater management, but it appears that that's been satisfactorily resolved. There was some supplementary evidence prepared by Mr. Fokianos, who is the technical expert for Shand, and that responded to some matters that have been raised by Roger Seib on behalf of the 42A author. And I think through that supplementary evidence of our witness, that those concerns relating to stormwater management and flooding have been satisfactorily addressed. That seems to be the message that's come through in the 42A author report. So if that's been taken care of, really the only issues that I think we're left with are the ones really that you identified, sir, at the outset, which is just this question of the split zoning and what's the most appropriate way to manage that particular resource management issue. And I just want to make one comment that emerged from the discussion this morning, and it was this question of whether or not there was scope to properly address some of these freshwater management issues in the context of the restricted discretionary activity rule for subdivision in the residential zone, because as I discern it, that's the critical question. If the entire site is to be developed as a residential zone or to be zoned residential, is there the ability within the subdivision rule to appropriately manage the impacts on the wetland and those freshwater issues? And I understand that the Section 42A author had some concern that perhaps there wasn't scope to do so, and I just want to address that particular legal point. Paragraph 49 of the opening statement that was read this morning stated that if there was scope to do so, she considered the most effective and efficient means of achieving the purpose of the Act, etc., would be to change Rule 16.4.1, which is the subdivision rule in the residential zone, to include an additional matter of discretion. And then she set out that additional matter of discretion, which of course enables a close look at the impacts on the freshwater ecosystem and receiving environment. But there was reservations about whether that could be done because of scope. Now, my submission on that point is that I suggest that the panel can be confident that it does indeed have scope to incorporate an additional matter of discretion like that. The reason I say that is because the question of scope is not simply confined to the question of whether an issue has been raised on or in submissions that have been lodged in respect of this plan review. This is a comprehensive plan review where all of the operative district plan provisions are effectively up for grabs, including this particular rule. And I looked at the rule that was notified and had come through in the notified version, and it's clear that the rule must have been subject to a number of submissions because it's already got significant amendments being made to it. But quite apart from whether or not this issue has been raised by a submitter, you have scope to amend this rule simply by virtue of Section 74 of the Resource Management Act and Section 75 of the Resource Management Act. Section 74(1)(EA) of the Resource Management Act states that you must change the district plan in accordance with an NPS or an NES. And Section 75, subsection 3 of the Resource Management Act says that you must give effect to an NPS. Now, the NPS on freshwater management contains a policy which is 3.5 bracket 4, and the policy is this: every territorial authority must include objectives, policies and methods in its district plan to promote positive effects and avoid, remedy or mitigate adverse effects, including cumulative effects of urban development on the health and well-being of water bodies, freshwater ecosystems and receiving environments. So I would say that there is a very direct obligation, in fact, for the panel to consider the very kind of additional criteria that the Section 42A author has identified, and in fact should be incorporated within Rule 16.4.1, and you needn't concern yourself with whether or not there's a particular submission on it that gives you scope to do so. So if the panel is satisfied that it's the concerns identified in the Section 42A report regarding scope is addressed, it seems, if I understood the Section 42A author's position correctly, it seems that if she could get this additional matter of discretion incorporated into the rule, then she's very comfortable with the full residential zoning across the proposed area. And if that's the case, then in fact we have no issues of contention between the planners whatsoever. And it's really just a question then of whether there are any outstanding issues as between the Shand witnesses and the panel itself. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to take any questions on that now, or if you want to return to those later, I'm in your hands, sir.
I think we'll press on and we'll address that in the context of the factual matrix if it in fact emerges.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So on that basis, we're sort of ready to have our parade of witnesses come and sit in front of the camera. I'm just conscious of time with 12:21. What time are you happy to keep going through to, sir?
Well, let's see how we go. Well, we're open-minded about that, but we're not anticipating this taking an extended period, and I don't mean to cut you short. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said there's one issue in contention. That's what our focus will be on, and hearing a lot, even executive summaries of things like transportation where there's no issue. We're happy for that to be entirely taken as read. So it's entirely your call, but if you were to confine the witnesses that actually appear to the ecology and to Mr. Dawson, that is Mr. Blaney and Mr. Dawson, we'd be content with that without directing you to do that.
Right. I'll take that signal. What I will do is I'm going to introduce you to Jackie Rogers, though, because Jackie is the representative for the Shand family and the Shand interests, and she is. She's produced a short brief of evidence which has signalled her historic relationship with Huntly and she just wants to make a few sort of opening comments and talk about what her vision is, and then we can move straight to those witnesses that you've identified, sir.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Rogers, and welcome.
Welcome. My background is, for all my life, I've been privileged to call Huntly area my home. I attended primary school in Huntly. Family involvement in Huntly. Our family has been an integral part of the Huntly community since 1914. My great-grandfather, Mr. Alexander Shand, settled in Huntly in 1914 to work in the coal mines. Instead of working in the coal mines, he started a commercial bakery, later called Rivermore Bakeries. Our aspirations are, we would like also to contribute to the economic and social revival of the community and the development of the Auckland-Hamilton corridor. I personally have had a keen interest in doing something positive with the Ralph Road land should the opportunity present itself. The proposed plan provisions that we seek for the district plan reflect those aspirations. We acquired the land in 2012. The hope was to develop some of it in a way that would benefit Huntly. We envisioned establishing an industrial park on the land with rail returning to the area. Industrial development is an even more attractive prospect for potential tenants, increasing the potential for greater job opportunities for the town. The proposed residential development adjacent to East Mine Road will help to ease the housing shortage and assist with housing affordability in the greater Waikato area. It would please our family tremendously to see other families enjoy the same benefits we had growing up in this wonderful town and region. We have resources, drive and commitment to ensure that the development of the Ralph Road land serves to enhance the town by providing housing and employment opportunities for the people of Huntly, for the community now and for future generations.
Thanks. Jeff, we'll just stay there and answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. I think we'll, as we've indicated a couple of times, we'll carry on, and if we do have any questions, we'll ask them at the end when we've heard from the witnesses. But thank you very much for your summary.
Andrew, no, we'll go straight to ecology, sir.
Thank you.
You're here.
Apologies, I'll have to turn in left and right. I've got my equipment here.
That's quite all right. Thank you.
Andrew Blaney, ecologist for Shand. I'll just give a brief summary of scope and summary of my evidence. So my evidence primarily focused on the delineation of wetland feature within area 166 and ecological values of that wetland area, and also identified within primarily the NES for freshwater context, the land use constraints and activity constraints that surround that wetland. I've also turned my mind to any potential effects of the residential development in a hydrological type regime, and what would be necessary to protect the wetland, and that's in the context of either a potential discharge or diversion of water from that wetland. That's pretty much it.
All right, very good. Thank you.
Any questions?
No, I think, as I say, we'll hear the planning context, and then we'll see if there's any questions for you as a group, even if that means sort of musical chairs.
Good afternoon, Commissioners.
Good afternoon, Mr. Dawson.
Just a couple of key things I wanted to touch on.
Thank you.
Summary of a summary. As Mr. Muldowney noted, the Shand, both the industrial and the residential blocks that are proposed within for Shand are ideally situated. They're within the urban limits. They're noted in Waikato 2070. They're adjacent to existing development in Huntly, service for 3 waters, have frontage to a formal road, and they essentially tick all those boxes that need to be addressed in rezoning. I just wanted to conclude with a comment on the discussion this morning from Lily Campbell about whether the residential site area 6 should be split or should be a single residential zone. In my view, the most elegant and appropriate solution is to rezone the entire block as residential. And as Mr. Muldowney pointed out, there is scope under the NPS to add that additional matter of discretion. I do agree with Ms. Campbell that the current residential zone provisions, the matters of discretion do not cover that specific point. So I do agree with the wording of her paragraph 49 in the zone extent summary she presented this morning. And I think with the addition of that matter, I think the panel can have confidence that the issues, the matters associated with ecology and that wetland, and the matters that are required to be addressed by the NPS for freshwater would be addressed. So that's all I really wanted to comment on, Mr. Chair. Happy to take any questions or comments.
All right, thank you very much to all of the presenters. Just before we do ask questions or see if there's any questions, I do want to make the point, and it's probably for Ms. Rogers' benefit more than anybody else in the room, and that is we're not trying to shortchange Shand Properties by cutting to the chase, as it were. You can take from us the very strong signal that if matters aren't in dispute, we don't have much interest in re-debating them. We've got expert evidence on different sides. We've got no contest as between the parties. So we're pretty comfortable with those issues. So it's really our focus on cutting to the chase, as it were. And I totally appreciate, and the panel totally appreciates, the effort that's gone into presenting the evidence for us. But the price for that has been the degree of consensus that has been reached. So we're not trying to shortchange anybody. We're not trying to deny people the opportunity to say their piece. We're simply trying to focus on those matters where there seems to be some disagreement. So I'd hate Ms. Rogers to leave here saying, oh, we got cut off early, we didn't really get a chance for all our experts to strut their stuff. It's simply because there's absolutely no point in them doing so from our point of view. So I just want to make that clear.
Thank you, Sir. Jackie's nodding.
Very good. That's always a bonus. Maybe let's see if the panel do have any questions. Could we start, please, with you, Mr. Marg?
Actually, no, nothing from me, thank you, but thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Sedgwick.
Just a question on the wetland. What is the size of that low-lying area, please?
It's 1.84 hectares.
Okay, and does that come from 1.4? Thank you. Does that come from a natural spring, or is it just a low-lying drainage area?
It's quite hard to tell where this wetland's coming from. It doesn't seem to be surface water fed, so it's either a spring or a groundwater. So I'm unsure, but more than likely groundwater.
And thank you. I'm pleased to see you in the chair. And from your evidence, you say that they're mostly exotic, the ground cover. Would that indicate plans for removing that and rehabilitating it?
I've identified in the report that I appendicized to my evidence that the wetland is dominated by exotic vegetation. It's not necessarily a prediction of it's required to be restored. In fact, I've warned that because of the type of vegetation in there, any restoration that would have to occur would be very lengthy. And you'd have to be very careful in planning it for an extended period of time, particularly the predominant ground cover in there is Glyceria. It's particularly tenacious weed to control and try and restore wetland in that context.
So let's leave it as it is.
It could be a case of, if it's not done properly and with a very long time frame of understanding of how long it's going to take, you could do more damage than good. And also with the MPS for freshwater and the NES, there are requirements within what you have to do restoration and limits on vegetation clearance, etc. So there's quite a lot of understanding and planning that would have to take place to restore that wetland.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. That's helpful.
Thank you. Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, just a question. Did I hear you say this morning that you were wishing to zone all that land between Russell Road and East Mine Road is urban? Was that right? And this is the wetland area we're talking about. But were you wanting to zone it all urban?
Yes, that's correct. Zone it as residential zone.
Okay, so if it was zoned residential zone, does that have any effect on then what you can do on that? For instance, the way that the subdivision has been laid out, the rest of the land would be grazed, I presume with cattle or some other form of which is now being managed. Does that have any effect on grazing animals on residential land?
Yes, Councillor. If we can, Fletcher, if you can just go to slide 11 in the deck, which gives a really good indication. Now, this was a concept design that was developed by our engineers, and that was the whole idea was to look at what the yield might be, how the site could be laid out, and therefore what sort of generation of wastewater, stormwater, traffic, and so forth. If you can see on the screen, that shows a likely layout, but it certainly does indicate the areas that would be developed for housing and those that would be retained as low-lying areas where the wetland is or where it likely would be grazed. And as we discussed earlier, the most appropriate solution, in my view, is to rezone the whole site and then work through the detailed design, looking at the exact locations for stormwater, wetlands, housing, and the delineation of that existing wetland that Mr. Blaney has identified.
I suppose my question really is about if it's zoned residential, the grazing and all that sort of stuff that can still be done in a residential area. Is that that's not a limiting factor to the usage of the land if it was zoned residential?
That would be my understanding, Councillor Fulton.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Just the industrial land on the eastern side of the rail corridor, and there was a block, and I saw there's a driveway up to that. Is that just because of its height, location, and so on above the protected area? Is that why that is taken, that small block up there?
Fletcher, if we can go to slide 8 in the deck, please.
Yeah.
So, Councillor,
Area 1A.
Referring to 1A, yes, the approach taken was very much driven by the flooding and the stormwater assessment that Mr. Fokianos completed, and that concluded that Area 1 was appropriate for the rezoning, Area 1A only for the stormwater from that area, and not for the actual industrial activity itself. And one of the reasons for rezoning it is really to keep that consistent zoning and enable that connection, and then ensure that that's always set aside and appropriately zoned for the stormwater infrastructure arising and connected to Area 1.
Okay, so that's managed through under the railway line, I presume. That's how it have to be connected. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And we have had some initial discussions with Kiwi Rail, and they have indicated a level of comfort with issuing essentially a right to occupy, in other words, to put a stormwater pipe underneath the railway line to achieve that.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
No, she's got a conflict.
Oh, that's right. She has two. Quite right. Mr. Cooney?
Yes, Mr. Muldowney, I'm sort of interested in your legal argument that we've got carte blanche to change a district plan review provisions when there's no submission on the point. It's pushing the boundaries a bit, isn't it?
No, I don't think it is, sir. I mean, the reality is that you've notified a district plan review ahead of the NPSFW coming into force, but that doesn't change the fact that you're obliged to still give effect to it now that it is in force. It doesn't, you're not simply confined. I mean, your scope and your ability to make these edits or these changes to give effect to the national policy statement is not confined by whether someone has submitted on that topic and given you the right to make that change. You have it as a matter of law.
All right, well, that's something I'll have a look at, but yeah. Have you looked at the issue whether we might be on stronger ground if we looked at the issue of consequential amendment? Because you're seeking a rezoning, and as a result, this issue has come up, and if the rezoning is granted, then you can make consequential amendments. Have you looked at that? Is that a possible argument?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, the submission, I don't think, sought any changes to the residential zone provisions. It just simply sought a zoning of the residential provision. So it didn't ask for any changes. But it may be that, yes, there's an ability to say that through the close analysis of the land area that is at stake, that there does need to be a consequential change. The other thing is, and as I say, I haven't done this work yet because it only came up this morning, but looking at the current drafting of the relevant rule in the residential zone, it looks as if it's had some pretty significant surgery already through this process. So I imagine there are some submitters and submissions that are having a good close look at the matters of discretion. And it might be worth just having a trawl of those submissions just to see, because it may be that there is in fact scope via those submissions, but I just haven't had a chance to do that work yet.
Okay, all right, well, we'll have a look at that. My other question is for Area 1, the permitted activity standards for industrial development. I raised it this morning.
Yes.
What's your thoughts on that, whether they satisfy the tests for having with allowing a permitted activity with those sort of standards?
Yes, I mean, I think that there's always a problem where you have to go to an extraneous document to determine whether you're a permitted activity. In terms of a sort of a model of drafting, you want to be able to read the district plan and determine whether you meet the standards for a permitted activity there and then. And of course, this rule doesn't allow that to happen. So you're going to have to go somewhere else to check to see whether the permitted activity standards are met. So it suffers from that structural problem, but I don't say that as a fatal flaw. It's just, I think, probably not what you'd call optimal drafting. But when I look at the things that you need to then test against, they're pretty measurable. I mean, the first is, was the lot to which the land use activity is proposed, was it created by a subdivision consent decision that had regard to a stop bank breach assessment? That's a factual question that the court, but not the court, but the consenting authority can say yes or no to, or the developer can say yes or no to. The next question is, was the stop bank breach assessment to assess the risks to the site and the future development of the site? Again, that feels yes and no to me. And then the final question is, was all flood hazard mitigation measures recommended in the stop bank breach assessment in place? So again, those are measurable and they feel like yes or no answers. So to that extent, I think the drafting works. As I say, it suffers a little bit from the fact that you have to go to a different document to examine, but I think it meets the sort of threshold tests of whether it can operate as a permitted activity performance standard.
Okay, yeah, I think the old test was to be objectively ascertainable. Yeah, okay.
Yes, and this will all be information that is contained within the files and records of the regulator. So it's not as if we need to go elsewhere. It'll be all sitting on a subdivision consent. And then, look, there might need to be some kind of site visit or site assessment to see that the flood mitigation measures that were recommended in the assessment have actually been implemented in the subdivision. But again, that feels like probably a 224C type criteria to be met. So I think once you get your lots issued, you can assume that all of the requirements of the assessment have been met. So I think we get there on this one. Yes.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muldowney and team. I don't have any questions might have been asked. So thank you very much for your patience and sitting through the morning and for the efficient way with a little bit of help from us in presenting your information to us. So thank you both, or thank you all very much.
Thank you to you and also to the entire panel. We're, as I say, grateful for your careful consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you. That means that we are now adjourned. Thank you all very much. I should just say, sorry, before we do adjourn, I should also say that as is our normal practice, Ms. Campbell's got the opportunity to provide a written reply statement just addressing any residual matters that have arisen during the course of the hearing. We don't set a specific time frame on that, but if we get that within the next week or thereabouts, or even a little bit longer, that will be fine. It's not mandatory, but if there is anything that Ms. Campbell wants to either agree with or reconfirm, then she's entitled to do that. So thank you all very much. We're now adjourned, and if the panel wouldn't mind waiting for a moment, please.
Thank you.